Chapter 598. Songji Xianling? This was a completely unfamiliar name. Fan Xian thought of a person called Songgon Zanpu. He shook his head and said, "This is the language of the grasslands." His brows suddenly rose. He thought that if this mysterious person had come to the grasslands from the outside, then this alias must have a true meaning. However, it should have its own meaning. This is the tribal language of the brothers in the north. It is not the language of the grasslands. Hu Gu sheathed his curved knife and said seriously, "I've investigated for 3 months and can already confirm that this person came to the grasslands with the northern tribes. I'm not sure about the meaning of Songji Xianling, but the Xianling should mean twinkling." Fan Xian's brows furrowed. Twinkling. Twinkling. Diamond, diamond, twinkling? He immediately thought of the name wrongly. He didn't think that twinkling could be an adjective or some kind of movement, such as flowers blooming. This proved that the Hu tribes did not have a unified language and would indeed bring trouble to many people. Fan Xian's head hurt. He had too little information on hand. What use could a name have? Helplessly, he raised his eyes and looked at Hu Gu. The brothers in the north are still moving toward the grasslands? Hu Gu nodded with a serious expression. It is already the 4th year. The first year, it was the brothers in the north who came as scouts. There weren't many people. The second year, it was the warriors among the brothers in the north. This group had the most people. In the last 2 years, it has mainly been the elderly, women, and children who had stayed in the north. They have moved with great difficulty along the path opened to the side of the meridian of the sky. If Songji Xianling is a tribe member in the north, then what year did he come to the grasslands? It should be the group from before. Although this person is mysterious, since he can influence the decisions of the king's tent, he must have the absolute support of the brothers in the north. Otherwise, who would listen to him? You're saying? Fan Xian stared into Hu Ji's eyes. The brothers in the north have already established themselves on the grasslands and received the king's approval? This is natural. They are very brave. Although there are only tens of thousands of them, almost all of them are warriors. Additionally, their tribes are more united than the people on the grasslands. Furthermore, their requests for water and grass areas are not greedy. Regardless of whether it is the king's tent or the 2 virtuous kings, they all welcome their arrival, Hu Gu said seriously. Hu Gu said very seriously, "Also, our brothers in the north never participate in the internal struggles of the grasslands, so they are the targets of all parties. Although their voices are still steady, they seem to be getting louder and louder in our ears." Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything. The source of the Qin kingdom's tight situation on the western border was because of the continuous natural disasters to the north of northern Qi. Heavy snow sealed the plains and forced the northern barbarians to migrate tens of thousands of li to the grasslands. The ruthlessness of the western Hu and the tyranny of the northern barbarians combined. The pressure on the Qin border increased. He felt a chill in his heart. If the Hu people truly united, Qin kingdom would be in big trouble. After decades of Qin kingdom conquest, the Hu people had long been weak. Additionally, there was the Overwatch Council's 30 years of slightly weakening provocations and evil schemes. The Shi-Hu side was not a threat. No one would have thought that the arrival of the northern barbarians would be like a shot in the arm for the Hu people. Songji Xianling seemed to have a way to bridge the divide between the Hu people. Tell me about the current situation on the grasslands. Fan Xian looked at Hu Gu in front of him. His expression was calm, but he was thinking that even if Songji Xianling could temporarily unite the Hu people, since he had found Hu Gu, he would certainly be able to tear open a large hole within the Hu people. When he thought of this, he couldn't help but feel a little excited. If the plains were a game of chess, then the next step would be for him and that Songji Xianling to place their pieces on the board. They would go back and forth and see who would emerge victorious in the end. Of course, it was him, Fan Xian thought. He had to win because he had acutely captured Songji Xianling's plan hidden in the deepest depths. He greatly loathed her thoughts. The temperature difference between day and night in the west was great. The sun slowly moved. It was as if the temperature in Dingzhou had given some order. It gradually heated up and cooled down. When the shadow of the mud wall in the city grew longer and longer, the sun set in the west, and the temperature grew lower and lower. Fan Xian and Hu Ji's first meeting came to an end. In his mind, he thought over the information he had obtained from Hu Ji's mouth. Fan Xian confirmed that he had benefited greatly from this trip. He then confirmed the method of contact with the other party, as well as the details of the contact, and began the final exchange of benefits. Regardless of whether it was gold, silver, treasures, silk, tea, or porcelain, it was all transported to the grasslands and handed to Hu Ji's hands without anyone knowing. This in itself was a troublesome matter. Fortunately, although the grasslands and Qin Kingdom had fought for decades, the tribes on the grasslands had long become accustomed to paying tribute because the Qin Kingdom had always held an absolute advantage. The trade between the two sides had never stopped. In other words, while the two sides were shooting poison arrows at each other at the foot of Tianshan, perhaps on the other side of the mountain, merchants were laboriously making their way to the grasslands to transport goods to the heart of the central plain in exchange for furs and other things. War and commerce did not interfere with each other. However, it would be difficult to privately smuggle important goods like ironware, salt, and grain. Since Fan Xian had the emperor's personal edict, he did not care about this. Hearing Fan Xian's last words, Hu Gu furrowed his brows and said, "Commissioner, there is trust between us. That is why I am telling you this path. I hope you won't disappoint me. If you really disappoint me, believe me, I won't need the king's tent to move troops. On the grasslands, I will be able to destroy you." Fan Xian knew what this Hu tribe ace was afraid of. He shook his head and said, "Don't worry. Although the scenery on your side is beautiful, I am not used to drinking horse wine. I have no interest in bringing an army over." Having obtained the promise, Hu Gu relaxed slightly. He raised his wine bowl and toasted Fan Xian. He then drained it in one gulp. The wine spilled down and wet his beard and clothes. Fan Xian smiled and raised his wine bowl, preparing to end this transaction. Unexpectedly, he heard a light whistle come from outside the shop. His brows immediately furrowed and he placed the wine bowl back on the table. This whistle was very light, like a shepherd herding a camel. It did not attract the attention of Hu Ji's people. Hu Gu noticed that Fan Xian had placed the wine bowl back on the table. His heart jumped slightly. He thought that Fan Xian still had some conditions. He thought to himself that the Qin people were indeed cunning and always liked to make exorbitant demands. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian looked at him and said, "Are there any problems with the people you brought?" Hu Ji's expression froze slightly. He understood that a problem had occurred outside the shop. He shook his head and said, "They are all children of my tribe scattered to various places. There is absolutely no problem." He knew that the matter was urgent. As he spoke, he began to pack his things and prepare to flee. If the Dingzhou military and governments knew he was in the city, they would stop at nothing to capture him. The two sides had fought fiercely these few years. If they could capture the top ace under the left virtuous king's banner, Dingzhou would be overjoyed. Fan Xian watched his movements but did not rise. He lowered his head and quietly said, "They are still outside the street. The encirclement has not formed. Leave from the back of the house. I'll hold them off for a while for you." Hu Gu looked at him with a strange feeling. He had taken the risk to come to Dingzhou. He had not thought that the person to meet him would be Commissioner Fan of the Qin Kingdom's Overwatch Council, such an honorable figure. It was precisely because Fan Xian had personally come that Hu Gu had placed more trust in him. This was very beneficial to their future cooperation. "I won't see you out." Fan Xian raised his wine bowl and said, "Be careful on your journey. We'll meet again another day." Hu Gu nodded his head heavily and accepted the heavy package Mu Feng, or handed over. Putting his finger to his lips, he whistled. Lifting the curtain, he followed the hole in the earth toward the back of the lamb shop. At the same time, a few unremarkable Hu merchants and workers outside the lamb shop also blended into the crowd. They are used to hiding everywhere. After all, their tribe has been massacred for many years. If they want to restore their tribe, there will always be many things that cannot be seen in the light. Mu Feng looked at Fan Xian, who had his head lowered as he drank. He knew what he was worried about and said, "I called the police early. Dingzhou will not be able to catch him." Fan Xian nodded. A few subordinates of the Overwatch Council disguised as Central Plain merchants rushed in and reported, "The guards of the Western Camp have entered the dirt street and will be here soon." Mu Feng glanced at Fan Xian, meaning to ask if he should retreat at this time. Fan Xian shook his head. Since the Dingzhou army had their eyes on them, then the carriages they had left at the mud wall earlier were also controlled by the other party. The three of them came to the lamb shop, but they left a few 6th Bureau subordinates behind to follow them from a distance. This was to prevent any accidents from happening. Since the two sides had met, there was no need to retreat. For the safety of Hu Gu and his group, Fan Xian had to delay the Qing soldiers capturing the spies for a while. "If the other party doesn't deal a heavy blow, we won't make a move." Fan Xian took a sip of wine and spoke to his subordinates. Mu Feng and the Overwatch Council officials met each other's eyes and nodded. At this moment, there was a commotion outside the lamb shop and the startling sound of horse hooves. Countless people charged in and surrounded the shop. Faintly, one could hear an official's loud cry. It was like he had discovered that a target had left the lamb shop. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and felt it was very troublesome. He stood up from the brick bed, turned around, and pulled out a piece of bamboo from the mat. He then walked out of the shop. There was a murderous aura outside the shop. There were at least 200 Dingzhou soldiers surrounding the shop. The long spears in their hands were aimed at the people walking out of the shop. The tips of the spears shot out wildly. It was as if they could turn the Central Plain merchants into mincemeat at any moment. Outside the encirclement were the well-behaved merchants. They watched this scene with curiosity and nervousness. They didn't know why the people of the general's manor would use such a large force to deal with these merchants. The clever ones had already guessed that the identities of these merchants were probably not that simple. "I can't let anyone suspect the escaped Hu Gu because of my existence." This was the true meaning hidden in the order Fan Xian had given earlier. This spy the Overwatch Council had hidden in Shi Lake was too important. Fan Xian didn't even dare trust anyone, much less in front of so many people. A soldier moved closer to the officer's ear and said something. The officer's eyes lit up. Presumably, he had confirmed the other party's identity. Looking at Fan Xian and his group, he said in a cold voice, "Someone, capture these spies." Fan Xian looked at the soldier's face and recognized him as the soldier guarding the east gate. It was this person who had examined their documents to enter the city. He immediately knew where the problem was. He couldn't help smiling helplessly and glancing at Mu Feng. Mu Feng knew that he had made some mistakes in his handling of the details and had aroused the suspicions of Dingzhou. He was angry in his heart, but he was afraid of angering Fan Xian. His expression became increasingly ugly. Surrounded by countless spears, he looked at the officer with a cold expression. His gaze was as if he was about to bring a bowl of water and swallow him alive. The officer didn't know what these merchants were thinking. Seeing that there was not a glimmer of fear on their faces, he became more and more certain that there was something strange about these merchants. As he prepared to give orders and send out a portion of his subordinates to continue capturing the people who had escaped, he urged his horse to stop in front of the merchants. He couldn't let the Dingzhou army catch up to Hu Gu. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. Mu Feng received the order. A cold light flashed through his eyes. With a push of his feet, yellow sand appeared. His entire body had already flipped up like a gray shadow. Pressing his palm against the horse's head, a short knife flew out from his sleeve. He was about to restrain the careless officer. Since the officer dared to ride alone in front of everyone, he had great confidence in his skills. Seeing the sudden change, he was not surprised at all. Raising the sheath of his knife with one hand, he slapped it toward Mu Feng's wrist. His right hand left the reins and went straight for Mu Feng's throat. His movements were clean and efficient. It was the authentic Yi family's grappling skills. This officer's martial arts were indeed powerful, but he only thought that these merchants might be spies. He had no idea of their true identities and couldn't help but underestimate them. He blocked Mu Feng, but he couldn't block the black shadows that rose up at almost the same time as Mu Feng. With a number of swishing sounds, the shadows descended on the officer's horse at the same time. One grabbed the hand, the other grabbed the throat. The swordsman of the 6th Bureau attacked. Even Fan Xian was afraid of them, much less this unremarkable soldier of Dingzhou. With a wail, the horse suddenly realized that there were 4 people standing on its back. How could it withstand it? Its front hooves softened and it fell down. A cloud of dust rose. The Dingzhou soldiers were shocked. They watched helplessly as their leader was easily captured by the spies. Mu Feng took the officer's knife sheath and placed the knife in his hand across his neck. Facing the Dingzhou soldiers charging over from all directions, he shouted, "If you're not afraid of death, then come." The officer's face was deathly white. He had not thought that he would not be able to block one move from these spies. Gritting his teeth, he roared at his subordinates, "Capture these people." He now believed that these people were not only spies but very powerful spies. For the sake of Dingzhou's safety, why would they care about his life or death? He didn't care, but Fan Xian did. If conflict truly erupted, the Dingzhou army would not be able to keep them, but how would they explain it to the court? "We are not spies." Fan Xian walked forward and looked at everyone warmly. "We are just merchants." With this disturbance, the officer did not have time to give the order to chase. Hu Ge and his group should have already safely escaped the encirclement. Fan Xian's state of mind had also calmed down. He indicated for his subordinates to put down the weapons in their hands. Smiling slightly at the brave officer, he said, "Sir, my subordinates are all rash people. I've frightened you." Naturally, no one believed such words. Even the most rash of Jianghu people would not attack the court's army. The officer touched his tight throat and found that he was still surrounded by these spies. Looking at Fan Xian in the lead, he ruthlessly said, "Let's see where else you can escape to." "We won't escape. We are truly just merchants. We just overreacted earlier." After saying this, Fan Xian couldn't help but want to cry. "Hu Ge, oh Hu Ge, I have truly caused a great deal of trouble for you." "Is that so? Which family are you merchants from?" The officer looked at Fan Xian darkly as if he was not at all worried about his safety. The Dingzhou soldiers outside didn't know what they were talking about. They only went to make an urgent report to the general's manor. At the same time, they set up the encirclement. No one paid any more attention to the people who could escape from the back of the shop. The Lingnan Xiong family, Mu Feng said, "Since you are merchants, come back with me to the manor for inspection." The officer gritted his teeth so hard they almost shattered. He roared angrily, "Otherwise, kill them on the spot." In his opinion, these spies were probably about to break out of the encirclement. However, they were controlling him, so it was inconvenient for his subordinates to act. No matter what, if he suggested that these merchants come with him to the general's manor for questioning, the other party would certainly not accept. Unexpectedly, after the young and handsome merchant thought for a moment, he nodded and said, "Very well, we are law-abiding merchants. Of course, we are willing to explain ourselves." The officer furrowed his brows. He didn't know what these spies were thinking. Did they not know that once they were captured, what awaited them would be endless beatings and interrogation? However, since the other party was so muddle-headed and stupid, the officer would not miss this opportunity. "Tie your own hands," he looked at Fan Xian and roared loudly. Fan Xian was obedient, truly obedient. He was even more obedient than he was in front of the emperor. He obediently allowed the Dingzhou soldiers to tie him up like a rice dumpling. Furthermore, his shoulder was hit heavily by a soldier. It was truly painful. The Overwatch Council officials under him were also obedient and obediently allowed themselves to be captured without a trace of struggle. On the contrary, it confused the Dingzhou soldiers. Because these merchant-like spies had once subdued their immediate superior in one move, these soldiers did not hold back. As they tied them up, they secretly used some heavy blows. Fan Xian stood by the officer's side and pleaded, "Don't hit people." The officer glared at him. He couldn't understand how this spy could be so daring. Resisting in the street was a small matter, but he could still speak to him so calmly. "There is still someone in the shop who has been drugged by us. Don't forget to bring him back with you." Fan Xian was more like a Dingzhou advisor. "What's with all this nonsense? Just wait until you can't even die if you want to," he said sinisterly as he stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Fan Xian did not get angry. He forced a smile and said, "The merchants I brought into the city have presumably also been captured by you. Please say something and don't torture them." The officer glanced at him mockingly. He had seen countless spies, but this was the first time he had seen someone as childish and laughable as Fan Xian. Fan Xian looked at him and said seriously, "We didn't kill you earlier. How about you return our favor?" The officer became more and more confused. He felt a chill in the depths of his heart and wondered if he had done something wrong. He subconsciously stopped his subordinates from beating up the spies. Something major had happened in Dingzhou. Another group of spies had been captured. Although there were spies every year and there were new ones every month, the spies captured in the lamb shop were different. First, they had come from the heart of the Central Plain. No one knew if they wanted to do illicit salt business with Shihu or if they had a bigger plan. Second, these spies were clearly strange. The upper echelons of the Dingzhou army took great interest in this group of spies. They had always disagreed with the court and Overwatch Council's decisions. They thought that there was no godlike military advisor in the Western Hu King's tent. The reason the Hu people had been so powerful these years was all because someone within the court had colluded with them and provided them with large amounts of support. These merchant spies who came from Jiangnan through Jingdou seemed to confirm this point even more clearly. This was a serious matter, so there was no time to use torture to interrogate these spies. Before the governor's manor could reach out, the commander of the military in Dingzhou had ordered the spies to be escorted back to the general's manor. When it came to stealing credit, regardless of whether it was the front line or the rear, it was all the same. The officer escorted Fan Xian and his group into the general's manor. He found that the general was personally interrogating them. He couldn't help feeling happy. He thought to himself that although he had made a fool of himself today, he had captured these important people. His merits still outweighed his faults. "We still haven't had time to ask?" The general sitting at the top ground his teeth until they creaked. "Then what are we waiting for? First, break their legs and then flog them 30 times. Then we can question them." The Dingzhou soldiers below shouted in unison and prepared to take action. The general spat on the ground and cursed, "Motherf *cur, how dare you not kneel in front of me? You're quite unyielding. What bullsh *t xiong family of Lingen? Even if you're from Xia Mingji, I'll still beat you up." Everyone in court and the military knew that Xia Mingji was Commissioner Fan's family property. There was basically no one in this world who dared to not give Fan Xian face. Strangely, this general's tone did not sound like he was bragging. Fan Xian raised his head with a pained expression and looked at the bearded general of the Western expedition. He wondered why this kid was so ugly. He sighed and said, "We can't beat them." The Western Expedition Camp's Imperial General, Li Hongqing, was angrily drinking strong wine. He wondered why these bastard Hu people never let him relax. Suddenly hearing these words, he unconsciously looked down the hall and unexpectedly saw a familiar face. The features on that face had changed slightly, but the mischievousness in his eyes was just as strong as it was in the past. He then gave some orders to ensure that the whereabouts of Fan Xian and his group would not be revealed. In 3 days, choose some prisoners on death row from the prison. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "My subordinates will help clean up the people in your manor as to what to do next. Naturally, they will do these things. We have to talk first." Li Hongqing continued to hold Fan Xian's arm like he was afraid he would run. He dragged him toward the back garden. The remaining officials of the general's manor and the Overwatch Council watched as their immediate superiors left with their arms around each other's shoulders. They couldn't help but stare at each other and sink into silence. They didn't know how to address each other or how to deal with related matters. After a long time, it was still the officer who had brought them into the manor who coughed and looked at Mu Feng. In a gentle voice, he said, "Sir, are you from the council?" Mu Feng nodded and did not give this person a pleasant expression. "Then that Sir earlier was Sir Fan Jr.?" The officer lowered his voice and asked with slight fear. Mu Feng knew of the close relationship between the commissioner and King Jing's heir and nodded his head seriously. The officer swallowed. Only now did he know what kind of person he had captured. Thinking that the other party was the little ancestor of the Overwatch Council he had been afraid of earlier, His face began to pale, whiter than the flowers on the grasslands. The general's manor was originally the manor of the Yi family. Later, Li Hongqing entered the Western Expedition Army. Given his identity, he had always lived here. 2 years ago, during the Jingdou Rebellion, half of the Dingzhou army entered the capital to quell the rebellion. Yi Zhong and Gong Dian remained in Jingdou and never returned. Thus, the general's manor became Li Hongqing's private manor and office. There were no other people in the manor. Walking all the way to the back garden, they didn't see a single servant. Fan Xian was secretly surprised, but he didn't show it on his face. Sitting on a cold stone bench in the garden, he got used to the cold and harsh atmosphere that was completely different from the gardens of the Central Plain. Only then did he speak carefully and say, "You have to explain clearly to your subordinates that no one can think that I entered Dingzhou today. So wordy. You came 10 days early to do business. The problem is, given your current identity, what is there to be afraid of?" Li Hongqing carried a large pot of wine and poured 2 bowls, placing them in front of each other. "I don't want people with ulterior motives to guess that I'm here to see someone because of my early arrival." Li Hongqing's hand holding the pot of wine paused for a moment. Fan Xian looked at him and said, "I won't hide this from you. I buried a spy on the grasslands. Today I came to see this spy, but..." He emphasized his tone. "Other than you, I don't want anyone else to know about this because the life and death of that spy will affect the lives and deaths of many people in the Qin kingdom." Li Hongqing thought for a moment and then nodded. He then said, "Just as you said earlier, I will take care of it. I will pick some prisoners on the death row to impersonate you. It will not raise any suspicions of people outside." "There is one more important thing," Fan Xian said. "The council needs a path to the Shihu tribe, and I don't want to be raided by the troops under your command, so I need your cooperation." Li Hongqing had already shaken off his earlier surprise and recovered his calm. "What exactly do you want to do?" "I will only remind you of one thing. Any grain you send to the grasslands could kill a soldier of the Qin kingdom." Without waiting for Fan Xian to open his mouth to explain, Li Hongqing stared into his eyes and continued, "I don't care what the court thinks. I don't care what schemes Director Qin has. I don't care if you are preparing to raise a spy to cause internal strife among the Hu people. However, I must remind you that the Hu people are a completely different kind of existence. You are not on the border, so you don't know their savagery and fickleness. You have to be careful about nurturing a tiger and inviting disaster." Fan Xian could feel the affection contained in the other party's warning. He nodded and comfortingly said, "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing." He raised his wine bowl and drank it all with Li Hongqing. He then let out a long breath and looked at the other party's bearded face and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. For a moment he didn't know what to say. The two of them sank into silence at the same time. The back garden was completely silent. King Jing's heir, Li Hongqing, had joined the army 3 years ago. During these 3 years, he had bravely killed the enemy and led the troops in battle. His reputation had long spread back to Jingdou and the Central Plain. The people all praised that after the great prince's western expedition, the royal family had finally produced another powerful figure who could lead troops into battle. It was because of his military service that this member of the royal family, who once had an unclear relationship with the second prince, was able to obtain the emperor's trust and take over Yi Zhong's position. He began to control the military affairs of the entire Dingzhou western camp. However, it had already been 3 years. This once dissolute, confident, and handsome heir had been polished into a different appearance by the wind and sand of the frontier fortress. Furthermore, he had not returned to Jingdou in 3 years. 3 years. Although the border is tight, looking at how you are in the general's manor, it's not like you don't have time to return to the capital. Fan Xian filled 2 bowls with strong wine and quietly said, "Why don't you go back?" Li Hongqing's hand gripped the edge of the wine bowl. His expression was heavy. After a long time, he slowly said, "Go back to do what?" Fan Xian knew what he was afraid of and glanced at him with disapproval. "It's all in the past. If the emperor doubted you, how could he let you control the affairs of Dingzhou? To put it nicely, I am a general, but my control over the army is far lacking compared to the Yi families," Li Hongqing said with his head lowered. Li Hongcheng lowered his head and said, "Of course, I also don't want the Western camp to become my family's soldiers. As you can see, I only have 4 trusted aides in the manor. The officer who brought you into the manor is a member of the Yi family. I can trust him, but I can't trust the officials in Jingdo." During these 2 years, the emperor has carried out a total of 4 rotations. 1 in Yanjing, 1 in Nanzhao, and the other 4 roads have all come to Dingzhou to play. Li Hongqing raised his head and stared into Fan Xian's eyes. "Although you have never been in command of an army, you should know that famous generals use experienced soldiers. This iron camp is truly flowing soldiers. If the general doesn't know the soldiers, how can the battle be good? When you return to Jingdo this time, you have to help me with something. Tell the emperor that the rotation cannot continue," Li Hongqing said in a heavy tone. "The replenishment of troops has indeed become more than enough because of the rotation, but when it comes to fighting, it is not the case at all. Furthermore, the attacks of the 14 Hu tribes are becoming fiercer and more cunning." Fan Xian cut off his words and said, "I know you've sent a document to the Bureau of Military Affairs. I've also seen the secret memorial you sent to the emperor, but you should know why the emperor has rotated these 2 years. Yanjing and Sangzhou are in a stalemate. The emperor is using the Hu people to sharpen his knives and train his soldiers for the future. It is a very difficult matter for you to make the emperor stop this move." "I don't care about the great cause of unifying the world," Li Hongqing said angrily. Li Hongqing said angrily, "That's right. If the day of the war comes, I am willing to be the emperor's vanguard and fight to the death on the battlefield. But right now, we are in such a tight spot. If Shiliang Road is really crippled by the Hu people, how can we unify the world?" At this moment, there was only Fan Xian and him in the garden, so his words were particularly direct. He criticized the emperor's national policy as bullsh*t. In any case, he knew Fan Xian's personality and didn't care if he heard it. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, "What can I do? In terms of military affairs, the emperor has never allowed me to interfere. It's not like you don't know." Li Hongqing sighed and raised his wine bowl to drink it all in one gulp. Cursing, he said in a low and pained voice, "It is possible to use war to train soldiers. However, 10 batches of new soldiers come, 7 batches go back, and 3 batches die on the grasslands. If we still use the old Dingzhou soldiers or the old subordinates of the Western Expedition Army that the Great Prince brought out, these people wouldn't have to die." But Fan Xian knew he had to remind Hongqing of some things to prevent him from unknowingly committing a taboo in the future. "If we only use the Dingzhou army and the old subordinates of the Western Expedition Army, how can we attack northern Qi and Dongyi? During the Jingdo Rebellion 2 years ago, the Qin family's rebel army was almost completely wiped out. The internal structure of the army suddenly became unstable, and military power dropped rapidly. The emperor must use Dingzhou to pick up the edge of the Qing army again. There's no need to talk about this anymore. Don't bring this up to the court again. Not only will it have no effect, but it will also make the emperor unhappy. Of course, the emperor won't just watch you suffer here alone." A slightly mocking smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. "Am I not also here?" Li Hongqing shook his head and didn't continue to discuss this topic. Fan Xian looked at him and suddenly said, "How often do you bathe now?" Li Hongqing paused. "I don't remember. About half a month to a month?" Fan Xian sniffled and laughingly scolded, "No wonder you smell so bad." Li Hongqing glared at him. Fan Xian smiled. "Dingzhou has deep wells. There's no shortage of water. Furthermore, you're a general. Can't you even bathe?" "I'm too lazy." Li Hongqing smiled and shook his head. "If you were like me and had once spent half a year fighting the Hu people on the grasslands and deserts, you would also be used to days without bathing. Besides, it's all work that involves fighting and carrying sticks. Beside me are a group of rough people. Who would care about this? The subordinates don't care, but do the concubines in the manor not care?" Fan Xian picked up a cucumber and stuffed it into his mouth to chew as he spoke indistinctly. Li Hongqing paused. A moment later, he smiled slightly and said, "There are no concubines in the manor. The people of the Yi family have all returned to the capital. I only left behind a few servants. Fan Xian raised his head in shock, not daring to believe his ears. King Jing's heir, Li Hongqing, had been famous in Jingdo for his dissolute ways. He secretly helped the second prince manage half the brothels and women under heaven. It could truly be said that he had a new person by his bed every night. Now, he was alone in Dingzhou without a single concubine by his side. Seeming to guess what Fan Xian was thinking, Li Hongqing used his index finger to gently tap the wine bowl and quietly said, "Ruoruo doesn't like it, so I quit." Fan Xian was speechless. A moment later, he faintly said, "I've let you down in this matter." "What have you done to let me down?" Li Hongqing laughingly scolded. Fan Xian shook his head and didn't say anything more. He opened his mouth and said, "When I first saw you at Isher Tavern, you had an assistant at your side. You were free and at ease. I didn't expect you to become like this now." There's nothing bad about this appearance. Li Hongqing thought of the things that had happened around him these 5 or 6 years and felt slightly moved. That day at Isher Tavern, there was also Guobaoquan, He Zongwei, and their group. If Li Hongqing hadn't brought it up, Fan Xian might have already forgotten who Guobaoquan was. "You punched Guobaoquan and later broke up his family." Li Hongqing looked at Fan Xian and said with a not quite there smile. Li Hongqing looked at Fan Xian and said with a not quite there smile, "He Zongwei has now become a very popular person in court and the emperor's favorite official. The affairs of the world are all like this. For me to be able to stay out of it, relatively speaking, is not bad." Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. "You're ruthless enough. Before you entered the capital, Jingdo had been peaceful for a dozen years," Li Hongqing continued. "Ever since you entered the capital, people began to die one after another. Presumably, you also did not expect that bastard, He Zongwei, to be able to climb to his current position. The Imperial Censorate has your Overwatch Council by the neck in the capital. He has begun to enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs to discuss matters and has already begun to threaten you." It had to be said that Li Hongqing and Fan Xian's attitude toward Sir He was strangely the same. Solemn. This was because they both held grudges and remembered He Zongwei's desire to eat Fan Ruoruo, the snow swan. Fan Xian smiled slightly mockingly and said, "The higher He Zongwei climbs, the faster he will fall in the future. I'm not worried about anything." "Of course, you're not afraid of him." Li Hongqing smiled. "Although I haven't returned to the capital, I've heard of the nickname, Servant of 3 Surnames. You must have come up with it." Fan Xian chuckled, tacitly agreeing to it. Li Hongqing pointed at his nose and sighed. "You still use the same tricks. First, you ruin someone's reputation. Then, using the emperor's favor, you begin to play unreasonable and sinister tricks. However, let me remind you that He Zongwei is not like me or the second prince. He is an official the emperor has raised. You cannot touch him lightly." This was indeed a trick that Fan Xian often used. Back then, he had used this trick to push the matter of killing prostitutes and ruining their reputations onto the shoulders of the second prince and Li Hongqing. In the end, he had forced the second prince to make a dangerous move. Then, Li Hongqing had been imprisoned in his manor by King Jing for half a year. Correct. There are many officials in the court who are beginning to cling to He Zongwei's leg, Servant of 3 Surnames. Actually, the master he has always followed has always been surnamed Li. Furthermore, officials are not afraid of things like reputation, Fan Xian said mockingly. However, these officials probably did not think that no matter how the situation in the court develops, He Zongwei will find it difficult to escape death. "What do you mean?" Fan Xian didn't hide anything in front of Li Hongqing. He smiled coldly and said, "The emperor used the Imperial Censorate to check and balance the Overwatch Council and reduce its power. This was something he told me beforehand. I agree with this rule. The Overwatch Council's dominance is not a good thing for the court or the people. But the Overwatch Council's vicious reputation is here. The emperor had to choose an official who dared to oppose me. Thus, he chose He Zongwei because he knew that no matter how things developed in the future, I would not let him go." A cold taste rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. Thus, he could only work hard to climb up. However, no matter how powerful he was and how he developed the Imperial Censorate to the point where it could oppose the Overwatch Council, so what? It was the Yamen of the Imperial Censorate that rose up, not him. On the day that the Overwatch Council truly becomes the Censorate, He Zhongwei will no longer have any value. Fan Xian shook his head. The emperor only has so many sons. Only the third prince can inherit the throne. Regardless of what the third prince thinks in the future, he will have to consider my attitude before he inherits. He Zhongwei has suppressed me for so long. What if he doesn't pay a price? He is grass without roots. He is only grasped in the emperor's hands. Thus, his life depends on how many years the emperor can live. Hearing this, Li Hongqing felt a chill in his heart. Fan Xian closed his eyes and said, "Everyone thinks the emperor is healthy and a great grandmaster. No one has thought that the emperor is now a man in his 50s or 60s. Li Hongqing shook his head. "I have to admit, I don't see things as far as you do. Naturally. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been locked up in the manor by King Jing for so long." Fan Xian smiled slightly at him. "Now that I think about it, you saved my life," Li Hongqing said with his head lowered. "If I had stayed in Jingdo 2 years ago, I'm afraid I would already be dead." He raised his head and sighed deeply. Just like the second prince. At the mention of the dead, the atmosphere became oppressive again. After a long time, Li Hongqing forced a smile and said, "Of course, this matter cannot be blamed on you. The words you said to the second prince in the tea shop outside Baoyue brothel that day, he later told me. I know you just wanted to bring the second prince down and save his life. However, he is actually as stubborn as you. He doesn't listen to what others say." From the beginning, Li Hongqing had stood behind the second prince in the battle for the throne. After Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council, his powerful attacks had only beaten Li Hongqing out of the poisonous waters of Jingdo. He had not beaten the second prince out. Fan Xian knew that the reason Hongqing supported the second prince was not just because of future benefits. Rather, it was because they were good friends to begin with. "I am very sorry for their departure," Fan Xian said. "But there are too many things in this world that we cannot completely solve. I've always been curious." Li Hongqing stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Regardless of whether it is the second prince or the crown prince, they are both working hard to carry out certain things. It seems that only you, from the beginning, determined that the torment of these princes would end in a painful failure. How did you determine this? Did you, from the beginning, calculate that they had no chance of success? "This has to do with my education from a young age," Fan Xian replied seriously. "When I was young, grandmother would hold me and endlessly tell me that the emperor was like this, the emperor was like that, the emperor was undefeatable, and the emperor was like this. I got used to it, so I accepted it. Furthermore," he shook his head, "in the end, reality proved that the emperor was indeed undefeatable." Li Hongqing was silent and speechless. He could only shake his head. "You should go back to Jingdo. I know you're afraid of being reminded of the past, but it's good to see the second prince. He, Chengqian, the empress, and the eldest princess are all buried on a beautiful hill. The scenery is not bad." Fan Xian sincerely persuaded this prodigal son who had left home and refused to return. Besides, the prince's health is getting worse and worse. As his son, you have to go back and see. Li Hongqing did not agree. He only sincerely said, "Father was seriously ill last year. It was all thanks to you taking care of him. Ro Jia's letter said thank you. There is no need for thanks between us." Fan Xian looked at him and casually said, "At the end of the year, Ruoruo will be returning to the capital." Li Hongqing abruptly raised his head. His eyes lit up. "Yi Ling came to Dingzhou to relax. How come I don't see her?" Fan Xian did not continue the previous question. Instead, he asked about another person he cared about a lot. After the second prince died, Wan had accompanied Yi Ling for a while. In the end, it was not very effective. Later, it was Yi Zhong who asked for an edict to have his daughters sent back to Dingzhou, where she had grown up. Li Hongqing was in Dingzhou. His friendship with the second prince was not shallow. It was indeed appropriate for him to take care of Yi Ling. Li Hongqing laughed bitterly and said, "After this Wang Fei saw the grasslands, her mood improved greatly. However, She is not someone who can stay idle. At this time, she is in Qingzhou. Qingzhou. Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath and said with blame, that is the farthest city. It could start a war with Shi Hu at any moment. What can I do? Li Hongqing glared at him. There are countless old Yi family generals in the western camp. Those generals look at Yi Ling, like she is a little ancestor. They don't even dare to make a sound. If she wants to go to the frontier to fight, kill, and heal, how can I stop her? Fan Xian repeatedly shook his head and scolded, what nonsense. Immediately after, he suddenly thought of something and said, fortunately, I'm about to go to Qingzhou. When I come back, I'll kidnap her and bring her back. After these words were said, it was Li Hongqing's turn to suck in a cold breath. He cursed angrily, you're going to Qingzhou? Do you want something to happen and then the emperor to slaughter the entire Dingzhou army to accompany you in death? The cover has changed. Everyone please look. This is the final Qingyu Year cover. Thank you for bringing out the crazy knife again. Also, I'm about to add the introduction. Yes, it's the last volume. I've done everything that needs to be done. Friends with monthly votes, please help vote. This month, I still need everyone's support. If I don't ask, there won't be any votes. Objective reality, please help me. P.S. I recommend a book, Food and Lust in the Tang Dynasty. The introduction is as follows. A few voluptuous girls, because they were drunk, transmigrated to the Tang Dynasty. They don't understand ancient Chinese and can't read ancient characters. With great difficulty, they start a business and settle down peacefully. Then, they run into Li Er wanting to cause trouble at Xuanwu Gate. Seeing that their dream of food and lust had become a bubble, survival or destruction was the question they needed to consider. Book number 1049646. Chapter 600. Fan Xian looked at him with an indifferent laziness in his eyes. Although Qingzhou is at the front lines, it is, after all, under the control of the western camp. There is no need to be so afraid. Li Hongqing used his finger to point at his nose and said angrily, you are a high official and noble. You want to go to Qingzhou with just a thought. Don't you know how much trouble you will cause? Qingzhou was the furthest city in the Qing kingdom. It was the land the great prince had forcefully taken when he first led troops. It was also the newest city. It hung on the edge of the grasslands and was empty on three sides. It was often at the point of conflict between the two sides. If Shi Hu knew that the Overwatch Council and Fan Xian had entered deep into Qingzhou, they would probably attack at all costs. Fan Xian swatted away the finger that was about to point at his face and angrily said, are you not a high official and noble? Is Prince he not? Is Yi Ling or not? But we are all in the military camp. Li Hongqing looked at him and angrily raised his voice. You think I don't know you? You will stop when you reach Qingzhou? I know you too well. With the grasslands in front of you, would you not want to go in? You like to take risks. You like to be sneaky. You never follow the group forward or backward. Can I just watch as you slip into the grasslands under my rule? Li Hongqing gritted his teeth. I'm telling you, there is no way. Fan Xian was silent. He had not thought that Li Hongqing would see through his plans at a glance. However, the dark fire in his heart was still burning. He had to enter Qingzhou and see what was happening, even if he didn't enter the grasslands. I promise you, I won't bring my subordinates into the grasslands. He gazed at Li Hongqing and said seriously, I just want to go to Qingzhou to investigate some things. If I don't come, no one will know exactly what has happened. Believe me, this matter is very important. What are you investigating in Qingzhou? Li Hongqing calmed down and looked at him. If you have an edict, I will let you go. If not, then don't say any more. If I had an edict, why would I be talking to you? Fan Xian saw that he was being stubborn and couldn't help but become angry. Don't forget, I am an imperial envoy. His Majesty has allowed me to act at my discretion. I am informing you because I respect you. If I really want to go to Qingzhou, what are you going to do to stop me? Hearing this, Li Hongqing gritted his teeth but couldn't find any words to refute. A moment later, he said in a cold voice, I must warn you, the border is not the same as before. It's easy to die. The Hu people have become more and more sinister, Their methods are similar to yours. Why were you able to capture me when you brought the Overwatch Council into the city earlier? It is because many spies have infiltrated Dingzhou. The Western Camp and the Governor's Manor of Shiliang Road are both nervous about this matter. Your disguises can't even fool me, much less those who. Li Hongqing stared into his eyes and tried to persuade him. Yi Linger is different from you. The Yi family is still respected by the Hu people in the West, but your reputation represents the face of the court. If the Hu people can kill you, they will pay any price. Spies? There are indeed many spies. Fan Xian let out a long breath and faintly said. In the past 30 years, the Hu people have been unable to send spies into our territory because we look too different. In these 2 years, it has increased. I am also very curious as to where these spies who sell our intelligence to the Hu people came from. A strange light flashed through Li Hongqing's eyes. Fan Xian gazed at him and said, "The most important purpose of my trip this time is to dig out that person, as well as everyone connected to that person. For this matter, I have prepared for 4 whole months. If you want to stop me, go ask the emperor for an edict." Li Hongqing raised his hands to indicate that he had given up. However, he continued to smile coldly and said, "Have you thought about what would happen to the emperor if something happened to you? What would happen to the people of the Western Camp? You overestimate the Hu people." Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly and mockingly said, "You underestimate me." Li Hongqing was startled. Suddenly, he pulled him in and walked toward the study where the map was kept. After walking through the garden, they came to a room. Lighting a lamp, Li Hongqing spread out a large map and slapped his palm heavily on a spot in the extreme west. In a cold voice, he said, "Look at the position of Qingzhou. It is 200 li away. If you want to go, I will send a troop of 1,000 people to escort you. If you don't want people to escort you, then I want to know, if the Hu people suddenly attack in the last 30 li of the flat desert, how will you deal with it?" Fan Xian looked at the map carefully. Although he had studied this map many times in the Jingdou Council, looking at it again now, he still felt a chill. The road to Qingzhou was close to the edge of the grasslands. Using their ability to come and go unpredictably on the grasslands, the Hu people could indeed launch an attack at any time. "I am a merchant. The Hu people do not kill merchants," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. In his heart, he was thinking about the agreement he had with Hu Ge. Li Hongqing did not respond to his words. Pointing at the map, he said, "These 2 years, the Hu people have come out of the grasslands every day to sweep through the fields behind Qingzhou. Do you know how many people have died? Once the Hu people get into a killing frenzy, who cares if you are a merchant or not? Even if you are a 9th level ace, if you are faced with hundreds of roaming riders, what way do you have to escape?" Without waiting for Fan Xian to respond, his finger continued to move on the map. "Look at this area. This is the direction the Hu people are mainly attacking. In these 2 years, over 1,000 field army soldiers have died." Fan Xian knew of the tragedy on the border and said, "Is there no way to solve this problem? I can guarantee that the metal riders under my command will not lose to the Hu people's roaming riders. However, this is like 2 people stabbing knives at each other. Both knives are sharp, but the target is different. They don't dare to touch my main force, but I can't catch their main force." Fan Xian said thoughtfully, "The Hu people's camps are moving, but our people are tied to the ground because of the fields. The damage they do to us is greater than the damage we do to them." Li Hongqing nodded his head helplessly. "That is why I have to go to Qingzhou. I have to see just who the master who invented this kind of bastardly tactic is." Fan Xian's eyes were cold. An underworld fire began to burn amidst the coldness. Knowing that he could not convince Fan Xian, Li Hongqing stared into his eyes and asked, "Why is the Overwatch Council paying so much attention to the Shiliang matter?" "It's not council business, it's my private matter." Fan Xian's mood was clearly terrible. Looking at the red dots on the map, he said, "Of course, it's not just a private matter. I have to stabilize the situation in the West before next year. I need your help. At the same time, I also have to cut off the support the Hu people have." "Before next year?" Li Hongqing looked at him with confusion. He didn't know why he was so anxious about the situation in the West. Next year, Sigujien can, at most, hold out until next spring, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, the Fourth Bureau put most of its attention on observing Sigujian's injury. This great grandmaster is really good at enduring. He actually managed to endure this much longer than expected. Although he has not seen any outsiders in these 2 years, we know that he is still alive, and we also know that he will die next year. What does Sigujian's life and death have to do with the West? Li Hongqing asked angrily. Fan Xian raised his head and looked at him. Because if Sigujian dies, the emperor will send me to Dongyi. I will no longer have time to resolve the problems in the West. Li Hongqing laughed coldly and said, do you think you can resolve everything in the world by yourself? I acknowledge your ability, but I hope you don't think too highly of yourself. Fan Xian knew that the other party's words did not have any ill intentions. He spread out his hands and said, after Sigujian, Dongyi will always lean to one side, regardless of whether it is the Qin kingdom or northern Qi. The biggest problem is how do we smoothly transition Dongyi into our hands? Or if the two sides fight, Dongyi can still maintain a neutral position. That's impossible. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and shook his head. Once Sigujian dies, the conflict between the master of the city and the sword hut will explode. What right does Dongyi have to be neutral? But you still haven't explained what this has to do with you rushing to Xiliang. Fan Xian glanced at Li Hongqing helplessly. After a moment of silence, he said in a low voice, the reason is simple. I have to prove to the world that I can resolve the problems of Xiliang and Dongyi. And then? Li Hongqing looked at him suspiciously. Then I want to prove to the emperor that if we truly want to unify the world, we don't necessarily have to fight. Even if we have to fight, it doesn't have to be a martial battle. A civil attack is also possible. Even if we have to fight, if we can, we will. Fan Xian's voice grew quieter and quieter. It was so quiet that even he didn't believe these words. Li Hongqing was also dumbfounded. He sat silently to the side, wondering if he had heard incorrectly. Li Hongqing suddenly stood up and quickly paced back and forth in the study. It was as if he was digesting the news he had just heard. A moment later he stood by Fan Xian's side and laughed uncontrollably. His laughter was filled with absurdity. Are you an idiot? Li Hongqing let loose a torrent of abuse at him. How can you think of such a childish idea? Do you think you're an immortal who can resolve the Hu people without using a single soldier? Without using a single soldier, you can resolve Dongyi and northern Qi? Li Hongqing's entire body shook with anger. Pointing at Fan Xian's face, his fingertips shook wildly. I thought you had some great idea going to Qingzhou, but it's such a childish and chaotic battle. What exactly do you want to do? Have you really been flattered by the Imperial College students to the point of forgetting your own name? Do you really want to be a saint? Li Hongqing abruptly grabbed Fan Xian's clothes and gritted his teeth. Are you crazy? No one in the world will obediently do as you say just because of what you think. The two of their faces were very close. Li Hongqing looked at the darkness in Fan Xian's eyes and roared in a low voice. Prove to the emperor? What exactly are you thinking about? Fan Xian lowered his head and said in a low voice, what am I thinking about? If I said I hoped for the world to be peaceful and without war, would you think this idea was absurd? Li Hongqing let go of his hands. Fan Xian sat back down in the chair. He looked at Fan Xian and shook his head for a moment. He was so shocked he couldn't speak. As a man of the Qin kingdom, how could he hate war so much? Fortunately, he knew how many times Fan Xian had experienced life and death situations in his life. He was not a person who craved life and feared death. This idea is not absurd, Li Hongqing said each word clearly. Rather, it cannot even be considered an idea. Fan Xian raised his head and said fiercely, why not? If I can use my own power to unify the world, why would the emperor need to go to war and let tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, or even tens of millions of common people die for this glorious goal? For the sake of so many lives, why can't I think like this? Fine. Li Hongqing nodded his head repeatedly. You can think like this, but you will never be able to do it. Furthermore, I advise you not to let the emperor know of your thoughts. Otherwise, he will certainly think you are crazy. I have been crazy to begin with. Fan Xian closed his eyes and faintly said, You don't know how I've lived these 2 years. Every day, I think about this problem. It seems that in the next moment, a great battle will erupt. Those common people who don't understand anything will die under horses or under knives and spears. I want to change all of this, but I don't know how to do it. No one can help me. No one can help me. He suddenly became angry. Opening his eyes, he stared at Li Hongqing and extended a finger. In a loud voice, he said, They've all left. Chen Pingping doesn't care anymore. Father has retired. Lin Ruofu has been scared into an old rabbit by the emperor in Wuzhou. And the boss? He'd probably be happy to go to war and not stay in Jingdou. Uncle Wu Zhu had also left. It was only him, Fan Xian added in his heart. It's only me. Fan Xian's lips trembled slightly. He gritted his teeth and said fiercely, It's only me who thinks and struggles at night. I am not satisfied. I know that this is a difficult goal to reach, but I still have to try. Absurd. Laughable. Childish. Li Hongqing shook his shoulder as if he wanted to shake this madman awake. The emperor used 30 years of time to create such a wonderful situation. If the emperor is prepared, he can beat them into trash at any time. In the current situation, you want to go against his majesty? Let me tell you, the emperor doesn't need you to do these things for him. He has enough power to do it himself. Li Hongqing looked at Fan Xian like he was looking at an idiot. In these 2 years, you had the Overwatch Council purposely reduce its power in order to stabilize the court. You allowed the palace treasury to regain its former glory, replenished the national treasury, and replenished military expenses. If you truly helped him pacify Shi Hu and take back Dongyi, you would have already made all the preparations for the emperor before a great battle. Yet, you want the emperor to give up on the idea of starting a war at this time? Do you think the emperor is crazy, or are you crazy? What exactly happened? What has happened to you these 2 years? Li Hongqing looked at Fan Xian in disbelief. The world is at peace. This sort of thing has never happened before. At least while I am alive, I hope for world peace. This can be considered my life's dream. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. After a moment of silence, he said seriously, Ever since I was young in Danzhou, I had always thought about what I wanted to do in this life. Later on, I gradually understood that if the world could be at peace, that would be for the best. 2 years ago in Jingdou, Fan Xian raised his head and looked at Li Hongqing's closely bearded and concerned eyes. Faintly, he said, I watched the second prince vomit blood and die, the eldest princess stab herself to death, and so many rebel soldiers, imperial soldiers, and subordinates of the Overwatch Council. Because of the goal of unifying the world, they became sacrifices on the emperor's path. It was at that time that I solidified this dream. Is it laughable? I've also seen dead people. Li Hongqing glared at him. In these 3 years on the grasslands, I've seen more dead people than you, but what can I do? History is always like this. Your dream has always been laughable. Do you know that? A laughable dream is still a dream. Fan Xian crossed his hands in front of his chest and recovered his calm. Quietly, he said, If a person doesn't have a dream, then what difference is there between them and a salted fish? In the entire Qin kingdom, no one will support your so-called dream. Li Hongqing gradually calmed down. He shook his head and said with pity, Including Director Chen and Minister Fan, no one will support your thoughts. I understand, Fan Xian said. I have always been different from most people in the world. I just want to use facts to convince the emperor. The emperor will never be convinced by others. Li Hongqing emphasized his tone. Who knows what hasn't happened? Fan Xian stood up. Don't forget, I am now the father of 2 children. You will have to get married and have children in these 2 years. We have to leave something for our descendants. At least, I hope it won't be a chaotic world filled with endless war and corpses. You don't think the emperor will unify the world? Li Hongqing asked after a long silence after hearing Fan Xian's words. It is easy to conquer the world, but difficult to rule it. Fan Xian tidied up his messy clothes and slowly said, Back then, The northern expedition broke up the Wei kingdom and allowed the Zhan family to inherit the throne. The people of Jiangnan, Jiangbei, Shandong, and Yanjing easily submitted, but the people of the Wei kingdom will not so easily lower their heads. Even if the Iron Riders of the Qin kingdom break into Shangjing, it will take decades for the people to acknowledge the rule of the Li royal family. Accurately speaking, it will take decades of suppression and slaughter. Fan Xian walked toward the outside of the room. I don't want Xiaohua and Liangzi to not see the beautiful scenery of West Lake and the East Sea, but instead see blood flowing and iron chains crossing the river. Thus, I want to try to change it, at least in a different way. But decades of blood and iron can be exchanged for 10,000 years of peace. Li Hongqing still could not accept Fan Xian's way of thinking. The situation of the world will unite after a long time and separate after a long time. Unifying the world may bring more benefits to the people, but I can't think that far ahead, Fan Xian said. I once said this to Yan Bingyun. I can only think about the moment I am alive and the moment my children are alive. I just don't want to be a salted fish. I don't want to be a saint. After saying this, Fan Xian walked out of the room. Inside the room, Li Hongqing's palms pressed against the map and suddenly said, "Why are you telling me this?" Fan Xian didn't turn around. He smiled and replied, "We are friends. I won't hide my thoughts from my friends." Then he thought of his friend in the flowery dress. His heart throbbed with pain. A few days later, the imperial envoy of Xiliang Road, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, and the Duke of Danbua, Fan Xian, entered the city to patrol on behalf of the emperor. The governor of Xiliang Road and the general came out of the city to welcome him. The entire city celebrated for 3 days. At the end of the 3 days, the general's manor investigated the case of the spies in the mutton shop. They found that Jiangnan merchants had secretly colluded with Hu bandits and smuggled salt and iron. A total of 14 people were executed. After the banquet, the imperial envoy left the city to send him off. On the same day, the imperial envoy, Fan Xian, had already disguised himself as a merchant and boarded a carriage headed toward Qingzhou, beginning his journey to investigate the case. Just as he had said to Li Hongqing that night, he had to calm the situation in Shi Lake and peacefully subdue Dongyi before the world went to war. Only then could he prove his ability to the emperor and the feasibility of his methods. However, this trip to Shi Lake was not only a step for Fan Xian to break away from his salted fish life. More importantly, he was going to resolve a matter that made him very angry. This matter could not be explained clearly to Hongqing. The carriage moved forward on the road between the boundless fields. In front and behind the carriages, Overwatch Council subordinates were watching everything cautiously to prevent the Hu people's grass-clearing troops from suddenly attacking. Fan Xian hoped that a small group of Hu people would come. Unfortunately, after that night, Li Hongqing had first launched the autumn attack in the 9th year of the Qin calendar. In an instant, the Shi Lake riders had killed their way back to the foot of Tianshan. On the grasslands, the empty rear of Qingzhou immediately became quiet. Fan Xian drew back his gaze from outside the window. He knew that the large movements of the western camp were completely to ensure his safety. Although Hongqing had not said it explicitly, he was using his actions to help him. His gaze landed on a knife in his hand. The style of this knife was normal, but it was made of very good material. It was definitely not something the Hu people's level of craftsmanship could make. The problem was, this knife was the Hu weapon they had seized from Qingzhou 5 months ago. The officials of the 4th Bureau in Qingzhou had cautiously sent this knife back to Jingdou and presented it in front of Fan Xian's eyes. This knife did not have any markings that could be used to investigate its origins, but Fan Xian recognized it at a glance because this kind of knife was made by a secret workshop on the side of the North Sea. Fan Xian's eyes were filled with a fire of anger that was difficult to suppress. The Jinqi in his body released and, with a crack, snapped the knife in two. Chapter 601. The journey was peaceful. The group of carriages moved forward on the official road. Occasionally, they could find the traces of the Hu people's bloody surprise attacks. Every time this happened, Fan Xian would get out of the carriage and look for a while. Then, he would have his subordinate Second Bureau intelligence officers carefully gather all kinds of information. Stopping and walking like this, it only took them 6 days to arrive at the most remote and shortest-lived city in the Qing kingdom, Qingzhou. Qingzhou was very different from what Fan Xian had imagined. Before coming here, he had carefully looked at the intelligence reports in the council and had even specifically asked the Great Prince about the specific situation on the Western Front. He had thought that Qingzhou was just a rather desolate and rundown border city, more like a heavily guarded military camp. Unexpectedly, when his group entered the city, they found that other than the soldiers walking back and forth, most of the people in the city were merchants. Merchants like Fan Xian walked through the few remaining streets and alleys in Qingzhou with hurried expressions. They hurried to exchange documents for exiting the border. In a loud voice, they called for hard labor and carefully stared at the goods they had brought to the border. All of this made Qingzhou lose some of its iron and blood color. Instead, it gained the rich smell of money. It appeared particularly messy. Fan Xian had thought that the court had set up a province here mainly for symbolic meaning. Qingzhou would be particularly small and dry. He had not thought that this place would have the feeling of a little Suzhou. He sat on the shaft of the carriage and looked at the scene in front of him with a pained smile. He didn't know what to say. Speaking of which, Qingzhou's abnormal prosperity was inextricably linked to Fan Xian. In the small city, most of the brave merchants who were busy entering the grasslands came from Jiangnan. The Qing court had always strictly prohibited trading with the Hu people. 3 years ago, Fan Xian had remonstrated with the emperor and secretly relaxed this rule. Salt, iron, and grain were strictly prohibited from being sold to the Hu people. But what was there to be afraid of selling luxury goods like jewelry, perfume, and strong alcohol to the Hu people? For one, it could bring a lot of income to the Qing national treasury because the nobles in the Hu tribes, who controlled more than 90% of the wealth, greatly welcomed these things. For another, it made it easier to send spies into the grasslands. Fan Xian had seen this in the past, but he had not personally come to Qingzhou. He indeed did not know that one thought of his had allowed Qingzhou to develop so quickly in just a few short years. It had already surpassed his imagination. It looked like they could earn the Hu people's gems, good horses, and blankets by using some small things that were not particularly valuable. Such a large profit made the Qing merchants extremely excited. They were willing to risk the danger of the two sides fighting endlessly and go deep into the grasslands to trade. Marx's words were very good, Fan Xian thought. He also had a plan in his heart. Since there were so many people covering for him, he should still be able to go to the grasslands. The border army stationed in Green Province was especially strict towards these merchants. Even though those merchant companies vigorously stuffed banknotes into the officers' hands, they still didn't speed up the inspection. Fan Xian and his group waited at the city gate for a long time but found it difficult to move forward. The autumn sun hung in the sky above the grasslands. It was a blazing white. Although it did not give the merchants and soldiers in the city too much of a test of heat, this kind of brightness made people's emotions begin to become irritated. After all, Qingzhou was too special. It was a strange city formed by soldiers and traveling merchants. When the soldiers became irritated, their attitude toward the merchants became much worse. Although the merchants' emotions were similarly irritated, they still lowered their heads and smiled obsequiously. Until today, the soldiers of the Western camp still could not understand why the imperial court would allow these greedy bastards to pass through Qingzhou and enter the grasslands to curry favor with their mortal enemies, the Hu people. As they sent out the documents, they were cursing in their hearts with ill intentions. They hoped that these shameless bastards who did not care about their lives for money would die on the grasslands under the arrows of the Hu people and never come back. Outside the inspection yamen, there were a few black-robed Overwatch Council officials sitting beside the officers and supervising the inspection of goods. Fan Xian gave Mu Feng a meaningful glance. Mu Feng immediately understood his meaning and began to prepare to secretly make contact with these colleagues of the 4th Bureau. After arranging everything, Fan Xian impatiently continued to wait in the carriages. He jumped off the shaft of the carriage and patted the dust off his bottom. Leading a subordinate disguised as a servant, he walked into Qingzhou. He pulled open his collar and raised his head to look at the white sun that had shrunk into a small circle in the sky with narrowed eyes. He also felt irritated in his heart, but he didn't sweat. He was very upset. Suddenly, the Qingzhou city gate not far behind him suddenly opened. A series of urgent and orderly horse hooves rang out outside the city gate, startling the long line of merchants waiting to inspect the goods. Everyone looked toward the city gate with curiosity. They didn't know which troop had returned. The troops returning at this time should have been out hunting rabbits on the grasslands after not returning all night. Hunting rabbits was a slang on the border. It had the same meaning as the Hu people's so-called gathering grass and grain. The Qing kingdom and Shi who had continuously stabbed at each other. They relied on this kind of sweeping and counter-sweeping to maintain the blood hatred between them. Although the Qing army was powerful, the troops that dared to leave the city to fight in the middle of the night still appeared very courageous. Fan Xian also heard the dense sound of horse hooves. He pulled his gaze back from the sky and looked toward the city gate. Perhaps it was because the sun in the sky was too hot that it left a burning white mark on his retina. When he gazed at the group of weather-beaten riders outside the city gate, particularly the general at the very front of the riders, it was like he was looking at the sun. The general leading the riders bravely attacking the grasslands at night was not tall. Contrasted by the armor, she appeared slightly thin and small. However, Fan Xian felt that her body was suffused with light. Especially the pair of eyes under her eyebrows that were as dark as the distant mountains. Her eyes were still very bright, so bright that there was not a trace of impurity. They were like jade reflecting the sunlight. However, her brows were furrowed. It seemed that she was thinking more than many years ago. The armor on her body was stained with blood. The horse beneath her was very tired. It looked like she had experienced a true battle last night. As if pierced by that pair of clean eyes, Fan Xian closed his eyes and lowered his head, hoping that she had not discovered him. A strange feeling welled up in his heart. This scene seemed to prove that something like time did not just advance in one direction. 5 years ago, Fan Xian had come to Jingdou from Danzhou. Outside the city gate, he had seen this girl with brows like distant mountains and eyes like jade. However, the girl who had called him teacher back then wore a light-colored dress and a playful white deerskin hat. Today, the girl was wearing a dusty military uniform and had an awe-inspiring aura. Time had changed many people and changed many people. It seemed that the only thing that did not change was their names. Fan Xian lowered his head deeply and used his subordinate's body to hide his figure. On the horse, Yiling was clearly tired. She did not notice that there were old acquaintances among the merchants on the side of the street. When the merchants realized that the leader of the riders was Yiling, they withdrew their gazes. These merchants, who had come to Qingzhou for many years, were already used to this scene. Since it was the young lady of the Yi family who led the troops out of the city, regardless of whether it was night or day, she would have to kill some Hu people before she was willing to return to the city. 2 years had passed since the Jingdou rebellion. The emperor was grateful for the Yi family's loyalty and gave a special edict to take away Yiling's title of Wangfei. In reality, he was silently allowing this girl to remarry. In the old territory of the Dingzhou army, all of the soldiers and commoners were used to calling this girl who had returned home Lady Yi. No one was used to calling her Wangfei. However, Yiling stubbornly called herself Wang. It was only a year ago that she had taken a knife and forced Li Hongqing to send her to Qingzhou. Fan Xian watched the thin figure on the horse gradually move further and further away. He was silent. He knew very well about Yiling's life these 2 years in Dingzhou and Qingzhou. He also understood why Yiling persisted in calling herself Wangfei and why Yiling wore a suit of armor. Perhaps it was only on the grasslands when she brandished a sword that she would forget the unhappy past. The environment of the grasslands and a life of iron and blood were indeed the best ways to make a person strong. The daughter of the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, the daughter of the person in charge of the Qing Kingdom's military, was fighting head-on with the enemy on the most dangerous frontier. This was probably something that had never happened before in history. Because of this drama, what Yiling received was no longer just sympathetic gazes and rumors, but respect and fear. Fan Xian was not worried about Yi Ling-er's safety because Li Hongqing would certainly not let Yi Ling-er sink into a dangerous situation. The people on both sides of the frontier all had a natural respect for the Yi family. The riders Yi Ling-er led were certainly the elite of the Qing army. Yi Ling-er had the strength of a 7th-level martial artist. It was enough to protect herself. Most importantly, this path of forgetting had been chosen by Yi Ling-er herself. Fan Xian greatly respected this. With great difficulty, Mu Feng-er exchanged for the document to leave the frontier. After being pulled by the Qingzhou military and reprimanded by the ear and endlessly intimidated by the dangers of the Hu people on the grasslands, he finally completed all the necessary procedures with a helpless expression. The goods were gathered in the Qingzhou Yamen. When they left the city and entered the grasslands, they would have to use the pass in their hands to pick them up. This was also because they were afraid that after the goods were inspected, some people would secretly tamper with them. Smuggling such things was rampant no matter which frontier it was. Some military officers would even bring in small groups. However, the Dingzhou general's manner turned a blind eye to this matter. Qingzhou was isolated on the edge of the grasslands. Life was unspeakably bitter. If there wasn't some outside money, no military officer would be willing to stay here for a long time. That night, Fan Xian and his group rested in a large shared bed. The entire large room was filled with the stench of feet. The night was bone-chilling. Fan Xian used his privilege to sleep against the wall. Although it was the coldest, it was also the quietest. Mu Feng-er lay beside him and repeatedly asked for forgiveness in a quiet voice. Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. In everyone's eyes, he was a descendant of the heavens. Not many people knew what kind of hardship he had suffered in his 2 lives. When it came to enduring hardship, everyone underestimated him. The night grew darker. A few strange movements came from outside the shared bed. Mu Feng, who had not slept, immediately woke up and prepared to inform Sir Fan Jr. Unexpectedly, when he turned his face, he saw Fan Xian's bright and calm eyes shining with light in the night. Like a wolf. The 2 of them quietly rose and met with the official of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. It was the clever person who had secretly sent the knife to Jingdou. In a dark corner of the courtyard, Fan Xian lowered his voice and asked the official, "How many of these knives are there?" "Just this one," the official quickly replied. "Originally, there were 3, but after I took one, I found that the other 2 were gone the next day." Fan Xian's heart chilled. Could it be? The official knew what he meant and shook his head. "It's not from the Western University. These spoils of war are not eye-catching. They are all piled up in the warehouse and no one notices. As for those 2 knives, they should have been stolen by someone. I'm not sure who stole it." "You didn't watch that night?" Fan Xian stared into the official's eyes. The official raised his head and replied in a small voice, "I watched all night and didn't find anything." He paused and then said, "If someone could steal a knife in front of me, it must be an ace." For some reason, Fan Xian trusted this subordinate's confident judgment. He smiled and asked, "How high?" "As high as the 9th level," the subordinate replied cutely. After a few words, Fan Xian found that he liked this 4th Bureau official whose name he didn't know very much. He didn't know where this liking came from. He glanced at the official curiously and didn't say anything. He thought to himself that the 9th-level disciples under heaven were all famous and powerful figures. How could a 9th level appear in this remote Qingzhou? Although liking was liking, Fan Xian's eyes under his slightly lowered eyelids became icy. His fingers bent slightly, ready to strike and kill the official in front of him at any moment. "One last question. Why are you so interested in this knife?" The knife that had been broken in the carriage had a very common style. If Fan Xian had not been very familiar with the material used to make the knife, he would not have discovered the hidden danger within. The 4th Bureau official did not feel Fan Xian's hidden but unreleased killing intent. Very respectfully, he said, "Sir, I am a member of the Qinian unit." The official knelt on one knee and presented an item with both hands. Fan Xian accepted the item and slowly stroked it in his palm. His heart was empty. This was the token of his most loyal subordinate. However, he truly knew nothing about this official's existence. He confirmed the other's identity and no longer had any doubts. He nodded his head. The official stood and said in a low voice, "I was personally chosen by Sir Wang to join the team. However, I have never stood out. A few years ago, I had been in the 3 large workshops. At the beginning of this year, I was moved to Qingzhou. Looking at this knife, I felt it was strange because this knife embryo should be a Type B steel from the 3rd large workshop. In the past, the weapons produced by the palace treasury may have been lost on the battlefield, but this kind of knife has not been distributed to the military. I felt the situation was urgent, so I quickly informed you." Fan Xian nodded and took a deep breath. He knew his good luck was still continuing. However, he didn't know who the 9th-level ace who had stolen the 2 knives was. He secretly deduced that if that person was his enemy, the court would probably be full of words attacking him for treason by now. Since the court was quiet, it meant that the person who had stolen the knives also wanted to help him cover up. "So, you were personally chosen by Lao Wang." In the darkness, Fan Xian smiled. It was impossible to see that his smile was slightly twisted. "No wonder your words are so interesting." Fan Xian opened his mouth again and said, "Concerning the name Songji Xianling, have you found anything?" The official stood and reported seriously, "There have indeed been a few more outsiders in the Hu King's camp these 2 years, but there is no Songji Xianling. I have no leads." Fan Xian said. "I have already had the 2nd Bureau investigate this name. Wait here. Once there is news, immediately send someone into the grasslands to inform me." "You are going to the grasslands?" "I am going to find the person who stole the knives." Fan Xian's voice was very cold. Immediately after, it softened. He patted the official's shoulder and said, "You did well this time. After you finish investigating this case, return to the capital to help me." "Thank you for your promotion." The official was overjoyed and knelt down to accept the order. He lowered his voice but could not suppress his joy. "I haven't seen Sir Wang in 2 years. I wonder if he is well." Concerning Wang Qinyan's whereabouts, Fan Xian had never made it clear to the officials in the council. Everyone, including Yan Bingyun and the others, thought that Lao Wang had gone to carry out the commissioner's secret mission. No one suspected anything. The Overwatch Council officials on the periphery knew even less. Chapter 602. 2 days later, Fan Xian and his group prepared to leave Qingzhou. This trip required them to go deep into the grasslands, so it was not convenient to ride in carriages. Other than carts carrying goods, the rest of the merchants all traveled on horseback. During these 2 days, Mu Feng had already naturally established a good relationship with the merchants and agreed on a journey. Early that morning, when large numbers of merchant groups began to leave the city, the Qingzhou riders, who had once again left the city to hunt rabbits, just happened to be returning to the city. The 2 groups brushed past each other. The riders did not look directly at these merchants. Although their superiors would sometimes send these riders to escort these merchants, most of the time, the 2 sides rarely interacted. Without the Qing army escorting them, perhaps these merchants would be safer. Yi Ling, with a tired expression, sat on her horse. A few strands of black hair leaked out of her helmet and mixed with her sweat. It was sticky. She used her finger to play with it. Her gaze unconsciously flickered to the merchant group outside the city gate. It was just a glance, but it was like she was attracted by a magnet. Yi Linger furrowed her brows and looked suspiciously at a young merchant standing next to a horse in the caravan. The merchant wore a cotton robe. It was ordinary and did not appear to be eye-catching, but Yi Linger felt that it was a little strange. From this angle, she could only see the young merchant's back. It was this back that allowed Yi Ling to discover his true identity. Her expression suddenly changed. A complicated emotion flashed through her eyes. It was Fan Xian. How could Yi Ling so easily discover Fan Xian's figure? Because Fan Xian was her teacher, he had once taught her little tricks for a year. Yi Ling had also taught him the Yi family's coffin breaker without holding anything back. Their palms crossed and their bodies fought. They were familiar with each other's movements, habits, and body characteristics to a terrifying degree. Yiling stared in a daze at the figure's back. Biting her lip, she suppressed her emotions. She did not ride forward. Instead, she cracked her whip, called out to her teacher, and cried loudly. She knew that since Fan Xian had come to Qingzhou in disguise and had not come to see her, then it was certainly not a private matter. Rather, it was an important mission for the court. The Overwatch Council wanted to make some noise on the grasslands. If it was not an important matter, a noble son like Fan Xian would not take such a big risk and enter deep into the grasslands. Yiling was no longer the spirited little girl of the past. She had matured a great deal. She would not expose Fan Xian's identity in front of everyone. She only glanced deeply at his back and then silently led her horse toward the manor. After entering the government, she didn't even rest for a moment before she said, "A few days ago, the Dingzhou general's manor gave the order for the autumn hunt. It is time for us to make some moves." A general who was listening at the side felt a chill in his heart. He thought to himself that Miss was getting more and more ruthless. It was just that they had launched an attack in the middle of the night, and their men and horses were already exhausted. He explained, "The great general's orders are clear. Qing province is not within the scope of this autumn hunt. Then we'll make it ourselves." Yiling lowered her head. She was no longer a little girl who had come to play, but a female general with a lot of experience. Add to that her identity and background, and the words she spoke, even her immediate superior had to consider them seriously. No one knew why Yiling insisted on the Qingzhou army joining the scope of the autumn hunt. No one knew that the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, had come to Qingzhou, left Qingzhou, and entered the grasslands. Yiling's suggestion was to use the Qingzhou riders to attract most of the Hu people's attention and protect the safety of the merchant group along the way. There have been especially many merchants this year. No one knows if the Hu people will suddenly go crazy. The nobles of the Hu tribe are still counting on the merchants to bring in an endless stream of goods. How could they go crazy? The general thought to himself and furrowed his brows. Don't worry about those merchants. If we send out troops, I'm afraid it will make things more inconvenient for them. Yiling didn't say anything. She lowered her head and thought that if the 3 roads into the grasslands were thrown into chaos, it should make it easier for Fan Xian to do things. Although she didn't know why Fan Xian had risked his life to enter the grasslands, she only knew one thing. Her teacher had always been the best at obtaining the greatest benefit from chaos. During these 2 or 3 days, there were suddenly many outsiders in the Dingzhou headquarters behind Qingzhou. Some of these people used the identities of court officials and said they were there to check on the expenditure. Some were merchants from various places. There were also hard laborers who had come to the West to make a fortune while the war was about to end. These people's identities were very messy, so they didn't attract much attention. They were only faintly divided into many small groups. There was a leader in each group. Just as Fan Xian's group left Qingzhou and began to head toward the Grasslands King's tent in search of Songji Xianling, these leaders quietly entered the general's manor. There was an important matter in the general's manor, so all the unrelated people had been chased out of the manor. If he couldn't delay the other party's commander on the grasslands, something might go wrong. Mu Feng glanced at Fan Xian and then at the long line of merchants in front of him. Furrowing his brows, he said, "These people move too slowly. Furthermore, they will stop at each tribe along the way. If we really walk to the king's tent, who knows how long it will take?" According to the original plan, Fan Xian's group of merchants should have separated from the main group of merchants yesterday. There had been a fork in the grasslands yesterday. Hu Gu should have sent his trusted aide there to receive them. Then, Fan Xian's group would take a shortcut and reach their destination. Unexpectedly, there was no one at the fork in the road to receive them. It was only one of Hu Ji's trusted aides who had found an opening and sneaked into the tent at night to express his apologies and explain the reason. The other 2 roads on the grasslands were being attacked by the Qingzhou army. As the foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner, Hu Gu just so happened to be there with his subordinates. Naturally, he had been moved to provide support. It was impossible for him to leave the majority of the group to receive the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council. Fan Xian didn't know this was Yi Ling-er's intention. He had not thought that his female disciple wanted to share his burden and instead brought him even more trouble. Since that person still hasn't shown himself, even if we get to the king's tent, we won't see him. Mu Feng-er looked at Fan Xian and reminded him. The other party won't make such a mistake. He knows it is a merchant group from the Qing Kingdom. He won't show himself in front of us. The horses slowly moved forward. Their hooves stepped on the autumn grass. Dingzhou is ready, Mu Feng-er reminded again. Mu Feng-er reminded again. In his opinion, even if there were so-called aces in the Hu King's tent, as long as they caught all the spies in Dingzhou, the other party would not be able to raise too many waves. Why take the risk? Fan Xian's thumb gently moved on the reins. A moment later, he said, I have to know who that person is. This is a very important point. If the other party is who I think they are, then I have to change my tactics. Just catching everyone in Dingzhou in one fell swoop will not have a fundamental effect. He had never heard of the name Songji Xianling, nor did he know what this name meant in the Hu language. But almost subconsciously, he thought that the person with this name was a woman. This was an unreasonable inference. It was somewhat mysterious and did not make sense. Fan Xian believed more and more in his deduction and became more and more angry. In the distance, there were a few white birds flying quickly on the knee-high grasslands. Fan Xian raised his eyes and looked. He could faintly see that behind the grasslands in the distance was a vast desert. What was further away from the desert? To the east of the desert is the North Sea. Mu Feng-er looked at his slightly furrowed brows and knew what he was thinking. In a quiet voice, he said, Beyond the vast North Sea is northern Qi. I've been to the North Sea. Fan Xian looked in that direction as if he wanted to see the reeds in the North Sea. Faintly he said, This desert stretches for thousands of li. It is said that no one can pass through it alive. Although the North Sea is beautiful, it is boundless. If one wishes to cross it, it is extremely difficult. I've been thinking about this problem. How exactly should one go from northern Qi to Shihu? First head south into the border of the country. Then, from northwest of Jingdou, head straight for Dingzhou, and then Qingzhou into the grasslands. That is where we are now. Mu Feng-er had clearly put in a lot of effort in Jingdou. It will take a long time, but it is convenient. Compared to forcefully crossing the North Sea and passing through the desert, it is more feasible. But the Shihu king's tent and the two virtuous kings would never trust a Central Plains person from the Qing kingdom, Fan Xian said with a cold expression. Fan Xian said with a cold expression, to win the trust of the seemingly warm but actually overly suspicious Hu people is a difficult task in itself, so I am very curious as to how they did it. In the next dozen days, the merchant group advanced deeper into the grasslands. Everywhere was a scene of autumn grass. Occasionally, they saw nomadic herders grazing hundreds of cows and sheep. They were like white clouds floating above the gently rising and falling meadows. It was beautiful and peaceful. This place was no longer the place where the Shi, Hu, and Qing armies fought, so it gradually gave off the feeling of a paradise beyond the Great Wall. Along the way, they passed through two large tribes. The Qing merchants had sold a lot of goods. The entire merchant group appeared much lighter, and their speed also increased. However, there were still no merchants who finished selling their goods and retraced their steps back. The most valuable goods were the lighter. Furthermore, if they wanted to sell them for a high price, they could only go to the Hu king's tent. Along the way, Fan Xian carefully paid attention to the Hu people's attitude toward his merchant group because this involved a very important matter in the future. He self-mockingly found that the gaze the Hu people used to look at the Central Plains merchants was still somewhat unfriendly and even contained a bone-deep hatred. The blood debt of thousands of years could not be washed away with gems and tea. However, the leaders of the tribes, the priests, and the nobles had a much better attitude toward the Central Plains merchants. Through Mu Feng-er's careful questioning, he learned from the mouths of the people in the old merchant groups that this change in attitude had only begun a year ago. It seemed that the Shihu king's tent finally understood the importance of trade and had given orders to the various tribes to strictly forbid them from harassing the merchant groups entering the grasslands. In some dangerous areas, they were even responsible for sending out the elites of the tribes to protect and escort these merchant groups. A year ago, there was a poor little tribe that could not resist the temptation of the Central Plains merchants. They secretly attacked and stole a lot of goods, angering the king's tent. He directly sent out soldiers to exterminate them, or rather, slaughter them. Not a single person from the small tribe survived. It was also this bloody example that made everyone on the grasslands understand the determination of the king's tent. It also ensured the safety of the Central Plains trading caravans. From then on, even though they still faced some hostile gazes on the grasslands, the Central Plains merchants no longer faced any dangerous swords or sabers. This was a long-term plan. Fan Xian secretly admired it. He knew that although the merchant groups were only selling some luxury goods, there was no life without trade. As long as the merchants on the grasslands were guaranteed to be unobstructed, who knew if the merchants of the Qin Kingdom, Dongyi, and Northern Qi would secretly disregard the Qin Kingdom's ban and secretly send daily and military supplies into the grasslands for the sake of profit. If this went on and the border was relaxed, the power of the Hu people would grow day by day. That day, the king's tent finally arrived. Looking at the crescent sea at the foot of the lonely mountain, the small desert beside the sea, and the large green grasslands, Fan Xian was slightly dazed by the beautiful scenery. The location of the king's tent was indeed different from other places. There was a different layout between heaven and earth. In particular, the green grasslands made Fan Xian feel strange. It was autumn, so why was the grass still green? On the side of the lonely mountain, countless cows and sheep were scattered across the wide grasslands. The young women of the Hu tribe were washing pots and utensils by the crescent sea, preparing to welcome the guests from the Central Plains. It was quiet. The sky here seemed to be much lower than in other places. It almost touched the ground of the grasslands. The autumn wind blew slightly and the grass bent low. It was very refreshing. Fan Xian dismounted and glanced at a normal Overwatch Council official behind him. He smiled and turned his head. Looking at the beautiful scene in front of him, he couldn't help but shake his head. After a while, the king would personally host a banquet to entertain these esteemed guests. The Western Lake man led the Central Plain merchants to a tent on the shore of the Crescent Sea and had them rest. After a while, the king would personally host a banquet to entertain these honored guests. This group of merchants was probably the largest group of merchants this autumn, so the king's tent was very attentive in entertaining them. However, Fan Xian still felt it was strange. The Western Hu people's attitude seemed to be overly good. Did that Songji Xianling really have such a deep influence on the king's tent? After eating some food, Fan Xian rubbed his stomach and walked out of the tent. Walking to the meadow by the Crescent Sea, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the surrounding scenery. His current identity was that of a merchant. Other than not being able to spy on the king's tent, the Western Hu did not forbid these Central Plains merchants from wandering around. No one on the grasslands knew him, so there was no need to worry about his safety. His mood also lightened. The sky is vast, the wilderness is boundless. He only had time to say these words before he was interrupted by a cry of praise from beside him. Fan Xian turned his head and saw a young man walking quickly to his side and hurriedly calling out good. Chapter 603. Fan Xian looked at the young man and smiled. However, the thoughts hidden deeply in his smile were not discovered by the young man. He had stood on the meadow for a long time and watched the young man walk out of the king's tent. He waited for the young man to gradually approach the meadow before he said those 6 words. He wanted to give the young man a chance to strike up a conversation because he knew that the young man who had walked out of the king's tent would want to speak with the merchants of the Central Plains. Striking up a conversation was one of Fan Xian's best skills. Back in the day, the Northern Qi Saint girl Haitang had also lost to his skill of the tongue, much less this young man. Of course. The young man chuckled. Although it was only 6 words, the aura of the grasslands was immediately forced out by them. This was an excuse. It was an excuse that the young man, who had been lonely on the grasslands for a long time and urgently needed to chat with someone from the Central Plains to relieve his homesickness, had found. His long years of working as a special agent of the Overwatch Council allowed Fan Xian to quickly make a decision in such a short amount of time. The young man's appearance was clearly not that of a Hu person, but he had walked out of the king's tent. He must have some connection to the person he was searching for, which was why he had acted. Someone from the Central Plains? Fan Xian looked at him suspiciously and asked, "I didn't see you in the merchant group. When I came back last time, there were some goods I didn't sell. The king treats us guests very well, so I stayed behind to see if there were any benefits." It was clear that this young man was not an expert liar. Fan Xian heard some problems in his tone. "This is my first time here." Fan Xian chuckled and pointed at the crescent sea and grasslands in front of him. "I didn't expect the scenery on the grasslands to be so enchanting. If you look at it for a long time, you'll get tired of it," the young man said with a pained smile. "I just got here today and haven't gotten tired of it yet." "How long have you been here?" Fan Xian asked curiously. "Everyone says that the Hu people are barbaric. Aren't you afraid that they'll suddenly go crazy?" After his disguise, Fan Xian had a handsome and sincere face. Additionally, his relaxed tone and sincere attitude made it easy for him to gain the trust of others. His conversation with the young man continued very naturally. This young man's surname was Wei Wuqing, which was probably a fake name. According to him, he was also one of the businessmen who came to the prairie, but he was forced to stay in the prairie. He had been here for more than 3 months. However, Fan Xian already had a plan in his heart. He would not believe these excuses. If they were merchants, how could they so easily enter and exit the king's tent? To deal with the homesick young man with sincerity, he easily got some information out of him by using the treachery in his sincerity. The young man's attire and the worn Hu leather boots revealed that he had spent a long time on the steppe. Through these conversations, Fan Xian obtained a lot of useful information. For example, there should be more than one young person from the Central Plain who had stayed in the Crescent Sea King's tent. There were at least 10 people who had stayed for a long time. There were also some slight changes in the king's tent these 2 years. In the end, this is the territory of the Hu. After clearing out the goods, Brother Wei, you should return to the Central Plains. Fan Xian sincerely invited, "If you come with us, your safety will be guaranteed." Wei Wuqing paused and didn't know how to respond. Looking at the young merchant's sincere expression, he felt a bit of guilt in his heart. He didn't understand why he had talked for so long with this seemingly normal young merchant. He could feel that this conversation was very comfortable. The other party was a person worthy of trust. If Wei Wuqing's deduction got out, the entire world would probably laugh their heads off. Was the Qing Kingdom's Fan Xian someone who could be trusted? "All right, I'll go ask the elders in the tribe," Wei Wuqing replied with a forced smile. Fan Xian was not stupid enough to directly point this out. He rose from the meadow and patted his bottom. "Brother Wei, see you tonight?" At night, the Western Hu King's tent held a banquet to entertain the merchants from the Central Plain. If Wei Wuqing was truly a merchant, then they would certainly meet at the banquet. Wei Wuqing hesitated for a moment and then explained, "The banquet tonight is to entertain you. We probably won't come." Wei Wuqing doesn't have an accent, but he is certainly not a merchant. Fan Xian drank a mouthful of goat milk wine and furrowed his brows uncomfortably. He said to Mu Feng or beside him, "Furthermore, he has been on the grasslands for at least a year. There are at least a dozen people with him who can enter and leave the king's tent at will." Mu Feng glanced at him and asked in a low voice, "Is it the person we're looking for?" "It should be." Fan Xian seemed to have not expected his luck to be this good. He immediately shook his head. Wei Wuqing is not a professional spy. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made such a big mistake. "I'm thinking, what exactly do these Central Plain people want to do by staying in Western Hu territory?" Fan Xian put down his bowl and looked at Mu Feng. "Most importantly, the person called Songji Xianling has yet to appear. Regardless of how Wei Wuqing and his group can help Western Hu, the reason the Western Hu king trusts them so much must be because of Songji Xianling. As you wish, I went to ask around, but I didn't directly say the name in fear of drawing attention," Mu Feng reported. However, during these 2 years, the chief of Western who has not taken a concubine. Other than his first wife, he hasn't even had a woman. Fan Xian paused for a moment. From the beginning he had thought that Songji Xianling was a woman. That was why Mu Feng had investigated from this angle. Hearing Mu Feng's report, Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh at himself. If it really was her, how could she have become the chief's favored concubine? There's another problem, Mu Feng said seriously. I feel that Wei Wucheng's appearance was too coincidental, so coincidental that it cannot be explained. His words cannot be completely trusted. What if it is a trap or a misdirection? My target has never been the Central Plain people in the king's tent, Fan Xian said seriously. Wei Wucheng's appearance may seem coincidental to you, but I don't think it's coincidental at all. He shook his head and said, the grasslands and Central Plain are 2 completely different worlds. If you don't stay here for a year, you will not be able to understand those people's longing for home. Wei Wucheng is still a young man. It is difficult to suppress his homesickness. Seeing us merchants from the Central Plain, he wanted to come and talk and hear what interesting things have happened in his homeland. Could homesickness really make people so uncomfortable? Mu Feng furrowed his brows. After he had been transferred from the first bureau to the Qinian unit, he had also been sent out on missions. He didn't think it would be that bad. Seeming to guess what Mu Feng was thinking, Fan Xian said, there will always be a day when the missions are finished. However, those people from the Central Plain or Northern Qi who enter and leave the king's tent, they may never be able to return to their homeland. After saying this, he sank into silence. The reason he understood Wei Wucheng's thoughts so clearly was because Fan Xian understood how much emotion a wanderer who found it difficult to return to his homeland and was stranded in a foreign land would have. It was just like him. After leaving that world filled with the smell of medicine, he could never return. Although he had never thought about it, it was still difficult to suppress his longing. Even if Wei Wucheng is homesick and wants to talk to the merchants of the Central Plain, are the people in the king's tent not afraid that he will spill the beans? He is using the identity of a merchant. We are unable to go deep into the king's tent to see the proceedings of the Western Hu nobles. No one can prove anything. It was clear that Mu Feng was still worried about Wei Wucheng and the commissioner's coincidental meeting. He furrowed his brows tightly and said, I just find it strange. Since it is a casual chat, why didn't he go find the Xiong family merchants or me? Why did he come find you? Fan Xian was silent for a moment. A cute smile rose to his face. He opened his mouth and said, my meeting with Wei Wucheng was not a coincidence. When he came out of the king's tent, I was already standing on the meadow and watching his every move. Mu Feng had also seen that scene clearly. He stood at the door of the tent by the Crescent Sea and watched the commissioner stand on the meadow and look down at the grassland and lake. I am good-looking. Even if I am disguised, I am still good-looking, Fan Xian said with a smile. Furthermore, I give people a feeling that they are willing to get close to me. When I stood on the meadow, the Hu women by Haizi's side were all looking at me passionately. Didn't you notice? Mu Feng's expression changed. Such narcissistic words were not easy to respond to. However, he knew that what the commissioner said was the truth. Perhaps he could disguise himself as a normal merchant, but he was certainly the most attractive of the merchants. I stood on the meadow to attract the attention of the young man hurrying out of the king's tent, Fan Xian said. I wanted him to see me at a glance and then come find me. If it was me who seduced Wei Wucheng to come talk to me, it would not be far from the truth. Mu Feng helplessly spread out his hands and said, so, it's a honey trap. The two of them chatted in the tent. In reality, they were waiting for the sun to shine down on the Crescent Sea and the arrival of the king's banquet. Before long, a Hu interpreter came forward to respectfully invite the guests. The merchants in the various tents all came out. They did not bring any goods, but looking at their chests, they should be carrying valuable gifts for the chief. Mu Feng also brought some. Fan Xian was not sure of the specific arrangements. He walked at the back of everyone and inconspicuously headed toward the king's tent. The largest tent at the foot of the mountain and the tall royal flag symbolized the noble status and great power of the person inside. Looking at this scene, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a strange feeling in his heart. This was the Western Hu King's tent. Inside lived the master of the grasslands. The Qing army and the master of the grasslands had fought and chased for countless years, but they had never been able to find this royal flag. Because the Western Hu King's tent could move at any time and its tracks were mysterious, regardless of whether it was the Qing emperor personally leading an army on a Western expedition or the repeated attacks of the Great Prince and the Yi family, they were unable to find it. They couldn't even get close. Fan Xian's footsteps moved slowly. He thought to himself that the king's tent, which tens of thousands of iron riders could not get close to, was right in front of him. This kind of attraction and temptation was incomparably great. However, he immediately calmed down. The Western Hu King's tent dared to make such a declaration in front of the world. It proved the other party's intentions and the changes the Central Plain people in the king's tent had brought. Only after entering the king's tent did he find that the tent was no longer like a tent. Rather, it was more like a palace with a unique style. The lofty roof was painted with strange patterns. A strange light appeared in the clouds and flowed with strange colors. It immediately gave Fan Xian a strange sense of familiarity. It was like he had seen it somewhere before. His status was the second manager of the leading merchant in Shazhou. Compared to the other major merchants, his status was much lower. He only followed Mu Feng and sat closest to the door. The master of the grasslands, the ruler of the Western Hu, sat in the main seat in the deepest part. It was dark inside the tent. It was impossible to see the chief's face clearly. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and tried his best not to draw attention as he stared in that direction. He could only vaguely make out that it was a middle-aged man in his 30s. Fan Xian found that his calmness was indeed necessary because there were 6 or 7 Hu aces by the Western Hu ruler's side looking down coldly. They were true aces. 3 or 4 of them were even more powerful than Hu Ge. Fan Xian lowered his head and quietly estimated that even if he performed to the best of his abilities, he could at most deal with 4 people. Furthermore, the king of the grasslands, whose face was hidden in the darkness, sat steadily and with the power of a wolf and tiger. It was impossible to tell how powerful he was. To want to capture the Tiger King in the tiger's den was not bravery. It was stupidity. Furthermore, Fan Xian did not have the awareness of being a suicide squad of the Qing army's iron riders. Thus, he lowered his head and nibbled on the leg of lamb. He was silent and listened. It was a pity that there was not much information to remember at the banquet. The mutton was not bad, and the Hu tribe servant girls who poured the wine were filled with a healthy beauty. However, the praises of the merchants and the passionate toasts of the great lords on the left and right were truly annoying to listen to. The king of the grasslands was not as rough as Fan Xian had imagined. After more than 2 hours of banquet, the chief had only said 3 sentences. It was these 3 sentences that made Fan Xian feel a glimmer of coldness. Although his tone was polite, there was a sense of intimidation seeping through it. In the detailed intelligence reports of the Overwatch Council, there were not many records of the chief. For one, the king's tent had always been secretive. For another, due to the continuous attacks of the powerful Qing kingdom and the successive defeats of the Western Hu, the chief's control and influence of the court was far from what it used to be. The reputation of the left and right virtuous kings had gradually grown. When the father of the current chief died, there were even rumors of choosing one of the 2 virtuous kings to succeed him. Although the chief had inherited the court with great difficulty, the entire grasslands faintly regarded the 2 virtuous kings as the most powerful. The Qing kingdom's intelligence work had long turned toward the 2 virtuous kings' tents. They had somewhat overlooked the chief. No one would have thought that the young chief in his early 30s would be able to control the situation on the grasslands so well and begin to greatly weaken the power of the left and right virtuous kings. In particular, he stood his ground against the opinions of the masses and welcomed the Man tribe brothers from the snowy plains in the north. He brought the tens of thousands of Man elites into the personal guards of the court. His power immediately increased explosively. Furthermore, there were so many people from the central plain in the chief's tent. What exactly did he want to do? As Fan Xian drank, he wondered about the chief's thoughts in the darkness. The chief seemed to sense something strange. Furrowing his brows, he raised his head. His eyes revealed a hawk-like gaze as he swept his gaze across the banquet. He didn't discover anything. When his gaze landed on the door, Fan Xian was drunkenly peeking at the bulging chest of the Western Hu girl beside him. With a glimmer of caution and reluctance, he played the role of a merchant's attendant very well. It was still the same old saying. The Qing Emperor and Fan Xian were the two most powerful actors in the world. After the large banquet, countless merchants had been forced to drink by the Hu people. The oil lamps hung high in the tents, giving off wisps of black smoke. The chief and the left and right Gai kings had all gone to rest. Only the two masters and the good men of the Hu tribe remained, relentlessly grabbing the Central Plain merchants and forcing them to drink. Fan Xian and Mu Feng had long passed out from being drunk. They were carried back to their tents. It was a pity and rejoicing that the Western Hu people's actions were not as preposterous and shameless as the Central Plain people slandered them. At least, in the tents of these Central Plain merchants, there were no seductive Hu women as beautiful as wildflowers. After the lamp went out, Mu Feng sat up with great difficulty. Turning his head, he saw Fan Xian's bright eyes. The gaze was like a wolf's. Involuntarily, his heart froze. In the common house in Qingzhou, Mu Feng had also seen this kind of gaze. It was completely unlike the usual gentleness and coldness of an adult. He didn't know if it was the knife-like autumn wind on the grasslands that made some ruthlessness in Fan Xian's heart resurface. Fan Xian handed over a hangover pill and didn't say anything else. He walked out of the tent. Taking advantage of the cover of the night, he passed through the Hu people's camp and came to the foot of the lonely mountain behind the Crescent Sea. He tied up his clothes and climbed up the mountain. Just as he was about to climb to the top, he found a protruding rock. Sitting on the side of the rock, he took out a small tube from his clothes. Very seriously, he fiddled with it a few times. He then stretched out the small tube and brought it to his right eye. It was the newest telescope produced by the palace treasury. Fan Xian had personally designed it and was the first to use it. Chapter 604. I'm sick. The stomach ache is hard to stop. My body is weak and very uncomfortable. That's all for today. If I can't hold on tomorrow, I will ask everyone for leave. In the black night sky, the multitude of stars was so beautiful it made one's heart palpitate. The faint silver light shone on the crescent sea below the mountain and reflected countless blinking eyes. The grass by the lakeside was soft and the wind was light. It seemed to be talking quietly to people in their dreams. Countless tents spread out from all around the crescent sea toward the depths of the grasslands. Faintly, the lights of the lanterns reflected the stars in the sky. Most of the herdsmen's tents were dark and quiet, bathing in the starlight. Fan Xian's hand holding the cylinder froze slightly. He watched motionlessly at the movement near the king's tent by the crescent sea. It was not until a long time later that he put down the cylinder. Lowering his head and pulling in his knees, he sank deep into thought. The chief of Western Hu walked into the small tent and did not come out for a long time. There should be aces of the Hu tribe guarding in the darkness all around. However, the entire defense system was much looser than usual. Probably the chief did not want the aces of the court to be too close to the tent. Who lived in that small tent? Fan Xian pressed his dry lips together. His mood was slightly gloomy. Perhaps this discovery was a bit strange, even stranger than Wei Wuqing's coincidental encounter, but Fan Xian did not suspect anything. The Hu people would never imagine that someone could watch everything on the shore of the Crescent Sea from a high and distant mountain. This was not something humans could do. Science and technology were the first productive forces. Fan Xian's fingers gently rubbed the cylinder telescope and he licked his lips. He did not leave. Instead, he waited quietly until the chief walked out of the tent. The 30-year-old chief of Western Hu wore a thin cloak. He did not have his knife by his side. After he walked out of the tent, he turned his head and bowed slightly. Looking at his expression, it seemed he did not want to leave. A cold and mocking smile appeared at the corner of Fan Xian's lips. After a few days, the large merchant companies in the Central Plain began to haggle with the high officials and nobles of the Western who court about the goods they were bringing. In order to wait for the people rushing over from the two virtuous kings' tents, the time was delayed by 2 more days. The reason why the royal court was showing goodwill to these merchants was naturally to solve the problem of importing resources in the future. However, the autumn sale this time was also a luxury goods trade fair with a large amount of money. The nobles of Shi who had the richest resources on the grasslands. No one knew how much gold and gemstones they had. They didn't even blink when they used them to buy the luxuries of the Central Plain. But even so, it took the merchants from the Central Plains 4 to 5 days to sell all their stock. During these 4 or 5 days, Mu Feng represented the foremost merchant group in Shazhou and was also getting close to the Hu people and earning a little money. After Fan Xian performed his duties simply, he began to walk around the Crescent Sea. Perhaps it was to say that he was looking, or perhaps he was being looked at. It had to be said that given his true identity, such an action in the heart of the Western Hu court was an arrogant and even stupid action. His eyebrows had been pulled closer, and the tip of his eyebrows had been glued up a little. His skin color had changed slightly, but his handsome face remained the same. Thus, when he walked on the meadows and sand dunes near the Crescent Sea, he was always met with countless burning gazes. Although the women of the Hu tribe were not as open as the Central Plain people slandered them, their attitude toward relationships and beautiful men was much more passionate. If Fan Xian could show off the muscles hidden under his clothes, he believed that this kind of passion would be like a fire in autumn and directly swallow him up. However, he didn't want to develop a relationship with the Hu tribe that could never have an ending. He walked around the Crescent Sea and only chatted with Wei Wuqing. Of course, no one knew whether or not he had hidden the thought of attracting another person's attention in his subconscious. The conversation with Wei Wuqing went well. This young man from northern Qi had probably been on the grasslands for a long time. It was rare for him to meet someone as good to talk to as Fan Xian. Occasionally, he would come to talk to him. From their conversation over the past few days, Fan Xian gradually understood some things. However, in the last 2 days, perhaps Wei Wuqing had received some kind of warning, he was more careful with his words. At the same time, Fan Xian found that there were a few more pairs of attentive gazes around him. Fortunately, it did not cause too many problems. The main thoughts of the nobles in the king's tent were still on the merchants and the power they represented. Fan Xian, the pretty boy in the eyes of the Hu people, did not attract much attention. Every night, he would climb the precipitous and lonely mountain on time. Holding a pair of binoculars, he spied on everything by the Crescent Sea. Late at night, the chief did not leave his king's tent every night to go to the small tent. But the frequency was unusually high. Fan Xian had long investigated. The small tents behind the king's tent were where normal Hu tribe servant girls lived. It was not very strange. What was strange was why the chief wanted to go there. What was strange was that Fan Xian and Mu Feng found that it was very difficult to get close to the small tents. There were many people protecting the small tents in secret, cutting it off from the world by the Crescent Sea. After waiting for 4 consecutive nights, Fan Xian became more and more confident in his deductions. However, he couldn't help but think mockingly that the master of the grasslands seemed to be acting a bit too respectful. Chilichuan. Under the Yin Mountain. The sky was like a dome. It covered the fields. The sky was vast. The fields were boundless. The wind blew the grass to reveal cattle and sheep. Does anyone know where Chilichuan is? Does the Yin Mountain refer to the mountain behind Haizi? Many of the tents near the court had been withdrawn. The area around the Crescent Sea became empty and quiet. The herdsmen who lived in search of water and grass had their own places to go. Without the goods brought by the merchants from the Central Plains, the leaders of the various tribes led their people back home. To them, the attraction of the royal court was still far less than the goods of the Central Plains. In a quiet tent, Wei Wuqing, who had been a member of the Western Hu court's palace treasury for a year, held a piece of paper in his hand and asked a companion beside him. These people had already been on the grasslands for a year. They helped the chief handle political affairs and gather intelligence. They had played an important role in the rise of the court. The Qing army's autumn hunt had already ended. The grasslands were preparing to welcome the arrival of winter. There were no major battles to prepare, so Wei Wucheng began to fall back on his old habits. Do you think you're still in Shangjing? Do you think you can still participate in the imperial examinations? One of his companions was clearly not in a good mood. He mockingly said, "When you have nothing to do all day, you just hold poems and songs and read them. Do you even know where you are?" Wei Wucheng was not angry. He chuckled and said, "This poem was given to me by a friend. It describes the scenery of the grasslands very well, so I memorized it. However, I don't understand two of the lines." These people carefully savored it and found that it was indeed the case. The words were simple, but they had a grand aura. It was not something a normal person could write. Just like this, the poem, "The sky is boundless and the fields is boundless," began to be remembered. It then spread to the Hu people around the court. It was then translated into the Hu language and sung by the Hu women as they waved their leather whips. It did not spread widely, but rumors were better than binoculars. They were born with wings and were even better than Yi Liuyun's lightness skills. A serving girl carrying a jug of goat milk heard it as she passed by the tent. She stood outside the tent and gently put down the earthen urn. She stared blankly for a while before wiping her milk-stained hands on her clothes. The chief also learned of this poem that night, but he did not pay much attention to it. There were too many things that a mighty ruler needed to consider, and he did not think that this poem could bring about any problems. He was only asked by someone to ask a few questions. When he found out that Wei Wucheng had heard it from the merchants, he did not care. The merchants of the Central Plains had already left the court for 3 days. Would he chase them back just for a small poem? Chief Yu did not care much about this matter, so when he discovered that the servant girl carrying the goat milk urn had suddenly disappeared the next day, he flew into a rage. It was as if someone had dug out an extremely important treasure from his heart. Fortunately, the serving girl had left a letter and advised him not to be impatient. She would be back soon. Only then did the chief stop the idea of sending cavalry to chase after the merchants of the Central Plains. On the grasslands, the autumn grass grew long and covered the roads leading in all directions from the court. Of course, there were no roads on the grasslands to begin with. As the horses trod more, there were naturally roads. In the direction of Qingzhou, a day's journey from the court, there was a large expanse of flat plains. It was incomparably quiet. The autumn sun hung low and was filled with a sense of desolation. The woman dressed in serving girl clothing walked out from the long grass. She then saw the young man across from her. There was a smile on his face, but there was a deep sense of disappointment in his eyes. The young man looked at the woman he had not seen in 3 years. He looked at her face and her eyes that were still as clear as lake water. No, they were even clearer than the crescent sea. He looked at her hands that were stuck to her side and said, "You've tanned." Haitang Duo, who had disappeared for more than 2 years, had now become a common serving girl in the Western Hu court. She gazed at Fan Xian and didn't speak. No one knew what kind of words she was silently saying in her clear eyes. Chapter 605. That year in Hangzhou in Jiangnan, Yi Luyun had toppled a building with one strike of his sword. Not long after, Haitang had received the Northern Qi Empress Dowager's edict and floated back to the north. After that, Fan Xian and the two of them had never seen each other again. They only occasionally exchanged letters. However, the shocking change in the autumn of the 7th year of the Qing calendar severed the correspondence between the two of them. The Northern Qi Saint Girl, Master Ku He's true last disciple, and the present leader of Tianidao had mysteriously disappeared from everyone's sight. Even the Northern Qi people didn't seem to know where she had gone. Fan Xian had had the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council and Baoyue brothel search all over the world for news of her, but they still came up empty-handed. She had disappeared so decisively and completely that it gave people the feeling that Haitang Duo had never existed in this world. Fan Xian knew that this woman had once existed and would certainly exist somewhere in the world. She was watching him and doing something because he had once held her hand and touched her heart. However, he had not thought that the missing Haitang Duo would appear on the grasslands to the west of the Qin kingdom. Furthermore, she had stayed on the grasslands for 2 years and changed her name to Songji Xianling. Do you not have anything to explain to me? Fan Xian looked into her eyes. His heart throbbed slightly. Slowly, he said, for example, why you are here, the matter of the knife, and everything related to Su Bida. Su Bida, the name of the chief of Shi who couldn't help but carry a strange sense of mockery when spoken from Fan Xian's lips. It was not strong, but it pierced the heart. Hai Tang immediately raised her head and gently combed a strand of hair at her forehead. Since you have already come, presumably you have investigated everything clearly. Why ask me again? Hai Tang was dressed as a Hu tribe serving girl with a leather hat on her head. She looked mischievous and cute, particularly with the strands of hair poking out from the brim of the hat, making her appear even more childish and beautiful. However, Fan Xian's tone remained icy. Some things it is one thing for me to find out. It is another for you to tell me personally. My anger lies in being hidden from me and used by others. You know my personality. Hai Tang was slightly startled. She pulled her hands out of her clothes and placed them in front of her. Very seriously, she gave Fan Xian a half bow and said, "My apologies." Although it was only 2 words, it was filled with remorse. Fan Xian looked at her. His expression did not change in the slightest. He also did not open his mouth. He only waited for her to give him an explanation. Let's take a walk. Hai Tang did not explain why she had come to the plains, nor did she explain why those blades had appeared in the hands of the Hu experts. She only very naturally suggested that the 2 of them take a walk on the vast plains. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "All right." Parting the knee-high grass, the 2 of them left the path hidden in the grass and walked towards the depths of the uninhabited grassland. At this time, the autumn sun was hanging high in the sky. The little insects were agilely moving in the grass. It was quiet all around, but there was a greenish-yellow color in front of them, blankly looking towards the end of the sky. The man and woman had their hands in their clothes. They were like 2 little dots in the sky and earth, maintaining a steady speed as they advanced towards the end of the sky. If there was nothing else in this world, perhaps the 2 of them would be willing to walk like this forever and not talk about the problems that would tear at one's heart and liver, and not talk about stories that would gradually pull each other apart. However, there were blue skies and white clouds in the sky, and wretched autumn grass on the plains. The 2 of them walked between the vast heaven and earth. In the end, they belonged to the mortal world. Even the way they walked now was difficult to be as harmonious as it was in the past. Was this not a heart-shaking loss? It has been many years since the Taoist sects have infiltrated Shihu. However, it has never been of much use. It is always difficult for the Hu people to trust the strategists of the Central Plains. The autumn wind gently blew against Hai Tang's red face. She sighed gently and opened her hands, feeling the vast aura of the grasslands. In a quiet voice, she said, "She who has been beaten into a mess by the Qing army. If we want the Hu people to become a force that can stand against the Qing kingdom, even if it is a force that can slow you down slightly, it is still a very difficult matter." Fan Xian was silent and listened intently. Hai Tang walked slowly and looked at the sun hanging over the grasslands in the distance. Narrowing her eyes, she said, 2 years ago, before my teacher passed away, he gave me this mission. What mission? Help the chief unify the grasslands and establish a country. Hai Tang looked at him expressionlessly. As you know, although the Hu people are good at fighting, there are countless tribes that are only nominally controlled by the court. As a whole, they are like scattered sand. If they are unable to unify the grasslands and establish a true country, how can they slow down the Qing kingdom's pace of unifying the world? Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "In order to stop the Qing kingdom, you are willing to allow a new grasslands kingdom to rise on the grasslands. Have you ever thought that if the Hu people truly become powerful, what will it bring to the world?" Without waiting for Hai Tang to speak, he stared into her eyes and said, "When we were in Hangzhou, you once reminded me that the Hu people are ambitious and cruel by nature. For thousands of years, they have always taken pleasure in killing. Unexpectedly, you now want to put on armor for this pack of wolves. Is the threat the Qing kingdom poses to you so great that Tianidao has to give up on the principles of the way? Facing his gaze, Haitang didn't show a hint of fear, saying slowly, "It's not possible to build a nation on the grassland in a short period of time. The plan of my late master will definitely take place 20 years later. I have to admit that I was stunned when my master returned to Green Mountain with severe injuries. I've never thought that your emperor would be so formidable." She smiled self-mockingly and said, "Since the Iron Riders of the Qing army have already become a foregone conclusion, how could the Qi kingdom be willing to become fish under the knife? Of course, I had to think of some way to slow down your steps." Fan Xian furrowed his brows and waved his hand, stopping her explanation. Straightforwardly, he asked, "This plan is indeed sinister and far-sighted. If the Grasslands court can truly establish a true country, the Qing kingdom will probably never be able to sleep peacefully. Even if we take down northern Qi, we will always have to worry about the situation in the west. This will also give you some opportunities to take advantage of." "But," he faintly said, "although I have only seen Su Bida from afar, I know this chief's nature is like a hawk's. He is definitely not a normal person. Since He chose him before he died, how could you make him trust your troops and follow your plan? You said earlier that Tianidao's intention to infiltrate the Western Hu court is not something that has happened in a day or two. How can you do all this?" Fan Xian lowered his head to look at the small leather boots on Haitang's feet. "Northern Qi people have already begun to enter the Western Hu court to manage political affairs for Su Bida and make plans. Presumably, other than civil officials, there are also some military advisors who understand the Qing military situation. How did you convince the Hu people to accept these Northern Qi people?" "You're talking about Wei Wuqing and the others," Haitang replied lightly. "They are not all Northern Qi people," Haitang replied lightly. "There are also people from Dongyi and the Qin kingdom." Fan Xian looked at her with slight surprise. Haitang continued lightly, "These people are only capable people hired by the chief with a large sum of money. They don't know me or my position in the court. What I need to do is to convince the chief, a ruler with a heart as wide as the sea and sky, that he should be good at accepting all outside wisdom. To subdue the 4 seas, he needs to use the people of the 4 seas." Fan Xian's brows were furrowed tightly. Looking at her, he said, "But you still haven't explained why Su Bida, such an ambitious person, would listen to everything you say. You have to know that in the Hu people's tribes, women never have much of a place." Haitang smiled slightly. A glimmer of interest suddenly appeared on her plain face. Looking at Fan Xian, she asked, "Do you think I'm using a honey trap?" Fan Xian paused and didn't know how to respond. He had long discovered that the chief had entered Haitang's tent more than once at night. Furthermore, it was clear that the chief had some feelings for Haitang. Haitang smiled and looked into Fan Xian's eyes. Sighing, she said, "I wasn't born as beautiful as you. Even if I wanted to use a honey trap, I don't have the capital." At this moment, a strange thing happened between the two of them. When Haitang sighed at Fan Xian's appearance, her arms seemed to rise uncontrollably. Her fingertips trembled slightly and touched Fan Xian's cheek. Sliding an inch across his face, the light touch of her fingertips against his skin was so bone-deep that it touched the deepest feelings in the bottom of their hearts. When the two of them realized that such a warm scene had occurred, they immediately froze. Fan Xian's body was slightly stiff. With great difficulty, he raised his left hand and grasped the hand beside his face. Holding it, he would never let go. Being held by Fan Xian's warm hand, Haitang's body was also slightly stiff. "I found that it is difficult for the two of us to walk as harmoniously as before." Fan Xian held her hand and quietly said. "Perhaps the amplitude of the swing is not the same. If we hold hands, would it be better?" "But the steps are still not the same." Haitang had a serene and peaceful smile on her face, but her words carried boundless regret and disappointment. "I have to try." Fan Xian didn't care what she was thinking. Holding her hand, he continued to walk deeper into the grasslands. There were only the two of them in the world. At least, in this moment, there was no need to say such unpleasant things. "Are you jealous?" Haitang half leaned on Fan Xian's shoulder. Their hands were held tightly together. It was as if they were both afraid the other would suddenly let go. At this moment, they were sitting on a meadow. Below the meadow was a small lake. Across the lake was the gradually setting sun. The golden rays of the setting sun drew a golden line on the surface of the water. Occasionally, a few wild ducks flew across the surface of the water, squawking strangely. This scene was very familiar. It was as if they were still in Jiangnan by the lake, and it was still the same two people. Why would I be jealous? Fan Xian said with some dissatisfaction. Su Bida was able to suppress the left and right virtuous princes in a few short years. The power of the court is the most powerful on the grasslands. Although you helped, he is indeed powerful. That was the greatest source of Haitang's involvement in the matter of Shihu. If they found out that the princess of the Karna tribe was a fake, what would happen? Logically speaking, if Haitang's identity was exposed, the northern Qi people's plot would collapse. This should be something that Fan Xian and the Qing people would be most happy to see. For some reason, Fan Xian believed that Haitang would not make such a mistake. Perhaps, the already dead Master Ku, he would not have thought of this link that could easily go wrong. Thus, he listened quietly to Haitang's explanation. What do you know about Karna? In the past, the court tribe of the northern grasslands had already been wiped out by Commander Zhang Qingfeng a few decades ago. From then on, the northern tribes were a group of dragons without a leader. Additionally, Shang Shan who was guarding the northern gate, so they could not cause any more major trouble. Haitang looked calmly into his eyes and said, "What did you like to ask me the most in the past?" Fan Xian's brows were furrowed tightly. He didn't know what connection these two questions had, but it was an important matter. He thought about it seriously. A moment later, he hesitantly said, "I like to ask you how old you really are." He smiled and explained, "Although I don't mind older women falling in love with younger men, I was afraid that you would be 40 or 50 years old and rely on your youthful skills to deceive a pitiful person like me. An old cow eating young grass, how innocent is the young grass?" A slight blush appeared on Haitang's face, but it disappeared in a flash. Shortly after, she smiled and said, "I still haven't answered you because I don't know how old I am." Fan Xian was silent. He knew that Haitang was an orphan girl who had been carefully cared for by Master Ku he from a young age. "I'm 19 this year." Haitang suddenly stared seriously into his eyes and said, "My mother was a princess who escaped from the Karna court." Fan Xian didn't hear these words clearly. He thought to himself, 19? Then, when he gave her the aphrodisiac by the North Sea, she was only 14. Was he teasing a lowly or poisoning a youth? This girl was indeed younger than him. Wait, princess? Mother? The Karna court? He abruptly stood up and looked at Haitang in disbelief. Haitang was sitting hugging her knees and watching the ducks dancing on the lake with a peaceful expression. It was as if she didn't realize what a shocking secret she had just told Fan Xian. "You are really the princess of the Karna tribe," Fan Xian said in a trembling voice. When it came to everything on the grasslands, he had calculated clearly. He had laid out all the countermeasures to the plot coup he had left behind. Even exposing Haitang's identity at the right time was part of his plan. He had not thought that Haitang's ability to influence the chief and secretly help the grasslands court build a country was not based on a fake identity. She was a princess. Haitang hugged her knees and placed her head gently on them. Looking at the pool of water and golden light in front of her, confusion appeared in her eyes. In a quiet voice, she said, "You are indeed calmer than me. 2 years ago, when I heard about my past from my teacher, my reaction was much greater than yours." Chapter 606. Fan Xian looked at her and couldn't say a single word. He finally gradually understood a principle of the world. Perhaps everything was predestined and predestined. Duoduo's background appeared strange. Thinking about it closely, it was nothing more than Master Ku he's occasional thought decades ago. However, this thought had floated into the future, landed in front of him, and landed on the grasslands in front of him. There was no need to consider how Haitang was able to make the people of the northern tribes believe her identity as a princess. There was no need to consider how she had done all of this 2 years ago. Since He had thrown out this variable before his death, he had long made preparations. He had deceived his brother and left behind a bloodline of the Erna court. How could he not have left behind some sort of keepsake or something similar? More importantly, your parents? Fan Xian asked quietly as he looked at Haitang's rarely seen dazed face. Haitang hugged her knees and didn't move. She felt this man's affection in her heart. He didn't ask about the grasslands and didn't press her. Instead, he immediately thought of the thing she cared about the most. They passed away when I was very young. The girl's face under the hat appeared somewhat lonely. Fan Xian didn't continue asking this question. As for Haitang's parents, how the last of the Erna nobles left this world, and whether or not it was he's doing, it was no longer important. Presumably, Haitang also didn't want to connect her teacher to that kind of character. However, she must have some guesses in her heart. Teacher said these words to me before he died and let me choose for myself what I should do. Haitang looked at the ducks on the surface of the lake. Her brows gradually furrowed together. For some reason, the ducks no longer splashed in the dusk. Instead, they timidly hid in the few water plants by the side of the lake. Your choice was to listen to his suggestion and return to the tribe. Then you came to the grasslands. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought. Songji was the Erna surname. However, this tribe had been wiped out by Commander Zhan Qingfeng decades ago, so no one in the world would think that the name Songji Xianling had anything to do with the Hu people. A glimmer of pity flashed through his eyes. Looking at Haitang, he said, "If you want to take revenge for your mother's tribe, you should take revenge on Northern Qi. Why target the Qing kingdom? Revenge? I rarely think about things that happened decades ago." Haitang combed the strands of hair poking out from under the brim of her hat and glanced at Fan Xian. In a quiet voice, she said, "Just like you, we all know that things like hatred often can't be washed clean. I just want to see how the people who share the same roots as me live. And the Hu are actually also people. They also have the right to live. Who knows how many people have died along the way during this long journey to the south? Don't tell me the women and children in the tribe don't have the right to live? As for the great Qi kingdom," she lowered her head and laughed self-mockingly. "Although Master revealed my past, he gave me the Tiani Dao. I am still the holy maiden of the great Qi kingdom. If I really wanted to bring disaster to the great Qi kingdom, why would I need to come to the grasslands? I just want the people in these tribes to have a stable country to live in." Haitang stared into Fan Xian's eyes. "Thus, I want to help Su Bida unify the grasslands, end the endless internal strife, and bring peace to the grasslands." Peace? Fan Xian's voice immediately became cold. The unification and peace of the grasslands will certainly lead to an all-out war with the Qing kingdom. Is this the future you hope for? I will keep Su Bida in check. Haitang lowered her head. "Childish," Fan Xian said quietly. The taste in his words was very similar to the mockery Li Hongqing had used to berate him in Dingzhou. The ambition of a ruler is never something you and I can keep in check. Then what do you think I should do? Should I just watch as the Qing army invades West day by day and one day take over the entire grasslands and slaughter all the people of the Hu tribe? Haitang furrowed her brows. Everyone has the right to live. Do you still think there is a difference in value between the lives of the Hu people and those of the Central Plain? Of course there is a difference. The lives of those close to me are precious. Fan Xian did not back down. You only think about how the Hu people will survive. Have you ever thought about the soldiers and people the Qing kingdom has stationed on Shiliang Road? Traveling west, I don't know how many houses have been burned or how many women and children have been killed. If this is the peace you want, then I will destroy all of this. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly as he stared at Haitang's face. This is a hatred formed over 1,000 years. Our generation has no way of erasing it. You stand in the position of the court of the grasslands and hope the Qing kingdom will back down. I stand in the position of the Qing kingdom and hope the grasslands will continue to be chaotic. Haitang rose and raised her head slightly to look at Fan Xian. You've already been on the grasslands for a dozen days. Presumably, you have investigated some things. Why haven't you gone back? What are you waiting for me here for? I want to confirm your role. Fan Xian's face was slightly pale. Perhaps you haven't even thought about it, but you actually still see yourself as a Northern Qi citizen and have never seen yourself as the Princess of Kaerna. In the name of finding a place to live for the grasslands, it is actually for the safety of Northern Qi's rear and to help Northern Qi slow down my emperor's footsteps. Without waiting for Haitang to speak, Fan Xian raised his brows and stopped her from speaking. This is a subconscious action. Speaking of this, I have to admire Master Ku He. He looked at Haitang with pity. You are a saint girl. You are the most outstanding figure after Ku He in Tianidao. However, your entire life seems to be the same as mine. You have been controlled by a lofty figure. Every step you make is within his calculations. Regardless of whether it is actively or passively, Ku He is using you to protect his Qi dynasty. Ku He had raised Haitang for nearly 20 years and understood his female disciple too well. He had long calculated clearly what Haitang's decision would be after she learned of her past. He knew that no matter how Haitang chose her path, it would follow his plans and give the Qin kingdom a painful blow. Haitang's expression became more and more desolate. These 2 years of assisting Chief Su Bida on the grasslands had truly used up too much of her energy. Now, by the lakeside, Fan Xian had directly exposed the thoughts hidden under her leather robe. It was only now that she discovered the sliver of thoughts she herself had been avoiding. None of us are saints. It is impossible for us to view the people of the world as equals. If you say I am sinister, then you are also selfish, Fan Xian said with a slight smile. Fan Xian smiled slightly mockingly and said, You used the lives of the West-bearded people to delay the Iron Riders of the Qin kingdom. It is to Northern Qi's advantage, but have you ever thought, do these people of the grasslands really need a powerful court and need to march east? Ku He is truly powerful. Fan Xian closed his eyes and slowly said. Although he lost to the emperor in the end, even though he died, he brought the Qin kingdom a great deal of trouble. It has to be said that the 2 brothers of the Zhan family are truly the best in the world. The Qing emperor had fought south and north all his life and rarely lost. The only time he had lost completely was at the hands of the Wei kingdom's commander, Zhan Qingfeng. Unexpectedly, decades after Zhan Qingfeng's death, before Ku He died, he had buried another landmine to the west of the Qin kingdom. You know I am not that kind of person. Haitang did not get angry. She stood quietly by Fan Xian's side and said, However, among the many choices, I chose the best path for the grasslands and Qi. Fan Xian knew that Haitang was not that kind of person. He was purposely trying to anger her. His gaze gradually grew cold. What about me? Haitang turned her head to glance at him and said, You said earlier that we are not saints. It is impossible for us to consider the people of the world as equals. Presently, it is the Qin kingdom pointing its sword at the world. Northern Qi and Dongyi are both swaying in the wind and rain. If you expect me to consider the Qin kingdom's interests, is that not absurd? Absurd? Fan Xian stared into Haitang's eyes as if he wanted to see into the depths of her heart. Faintly, he said, A few years ago in a restaurant in Shangjing, as the commissioner of the Qin kingdom's Overwatch Council, I made that agreement with you. Is that not absurd? He smiled self-mockingly. That's right. I was a Qin noble, yet I had to raise my face to let you slap it. The Iron Riders of the Qin kingdom were about to trample the world, yet I had to make an agreement with the saint girl of a foreign country. Peace? Goddamn peace. It is indeed absurd. My existence in this world has always been an absurd thing. Farming, drinking, and chatting had set the world for 20 years. Thinking back to when the 2 of them had walked arm in arm in Shangjing, drunk together in a building, and chatted together under the melon trellis in the garden, in a place no one knew about, the 2 most outstanding young people in Northern Qi and the Qin kingdom had set a goal that was childish in the eyes of the common people but particularly beautiful in their eyes. No war under heaven. Because of the 2 people who participated in this agreement, such a childish agreement seemed to be within reach, and could become a reality at any time. This was because these two young people had great influence in their respective countries. If the situation did not change, the old people would gradually leave, and the future of the country would be in the hands of these two young people. A number of years had passed in the blink of an eye. The situation in the world had changed drastically because of the explosion of the Dong Mountain incident. The world was changing and people were also changing. It had not even been 20 years, yet it seemed that Fan Xian and Haitang could no longer farm, drink, and chat. I can't accept this. Fan Xian's face was pale, but his eyes grew brighter and brighter. I've already left Danzhou for 5 years. During these 5 years, no one knows what I want to do. Only you know how much danger I've taken for this agreement, how much I've suffered, and how much I've helped Northern Qi. He stared into Haitang's eyes and said in a raspy voice, "You know all of this very well. I did not hesitate to take the risk of being accused of being a traitor 1,000 years later. And you ran off without a sound, came to the grasslands, and began to stab me in the back. I can't accept this." Fan Xian's eyes gradually grew cold. Haitang looked at Fan Xian's face and listened to his faint words. For some reason, it was like her heart had been stabbed with a knife and began to ache. It was so painful that her face turned white. "I had not thought that this matter would implicate you." Haitang stared at him in a daze. She felt that the pain of the man in front of her seemed to have landed on her body. "I also don't know where those knives came from. After learning of this matter, I made a trip to Qingzhou. However, one of them was stolen by someone." Although Fan Xian had long guessed that it was Haitang's doing to have a 9th level ace sneak into Qingzhou to help him destroy the evidence, hearing her personally admit it now made his mood slightly better. However, his expression was still very ugly. "You're still hiding it from me. The appearance of these knives has always been a strange matter." He grabbed the front of Haitang's clothes and gritted his teeth. "Your contact with the little emperor of Northern Qi has never been broken. This time, it is clear that he is tricking me. What else do you want to hide for him?" Haitang placed her hand on his. She didn't use any force. Looking into his eyes with pity and guilt, she said, "I truly don't know about this matter. I also don't know what problems have occurred in Shangjing. Why would the emperor do such a stupid thing?" It was indeed stupid. In the Qing kingdom, Northern Qi's greatest support was Fan Xian. Although after the Dong Mountain incident, Fan Xian had gradually severed his relationship with Northern Qi. If the Northern Qi emperor truly wanted to have a future, it would be difficult without Fan Xian's help. Fan Xian knew very well what the little emperor of Northern Qi was thinking. He moved closer to Haitang's slightly red face and said quietly into her ear, "Not stupid at all. He wants to force me to rebel? Impossible. 2 years ago in Jingdou, he wanted to use the eldest princess's hand to kill me and help the emperor ascend. I haven't settled this debt with him yet. How could I rebel?" There was a glimmer of mockery in his words, but Haitang's heart grew cold. This was the first time she knew that there was a shadow of Northern Qi in the rebellion in Jingdou 2 years ago. Thinking of it this way, the context of this matter became clear. The Northern Qi emperor knew that Fan Xian was a very vengeful person. He didn't continue to place his hopes on him. Additionally, Haitang had been on the grasslands for 2 years and was unable to act as a bridge between the Northern Qi emperor and Fan Xian. The two sides gradually drifted apart. For the sake of Northern Qi's safety, the Northern Qi emperor would certainly choose to destroy the relationship between Fan Xian and the Qing emperor. The emperor had no other choice. The posture between Haitang and Fan Xian was very warm, but the words the two of them spoke were shocking. Faintly she said, "These 2 years, you've helped the Qing emperor organize his governance, govern the people, and manage the palace treasury. A great battle is about to break out at any moment. How could he trust you?" "I don't care if he trusts me or not. Right now, I don't even need your trust." Fan Xian shook his head and rubbed his cheek against Haitang's slightly cold face. He took a deep breath and said, "Take a message to the Northern Qi emperor. Tell him that I, Fan Xian, will repay him with a lesson he will never forget for the 2 gifts he has given me." Haitang's body trembled. She looked at Fan Xian in surprise, not knowing what he would do. In this world, Other than a great grandmaster, probably only Fan Xian would dare to be so arrogant as to say that he would teach the ruler of a country a lesson. Don't forget, you are a person of the Qing kingdom. You are the son of the Qing emperor. Haitang sighed. Haitang sighed and said, "Who would believe that you would consider problems from the standpoint of northern Qi or Dongyi? It is normal for the emperor not to believe you. I consider problems from the standpoint of the Qing kingdom. I also don't want the people of the Qing kingdom to sink into the endless blood and fire of war. You will certainly not tell me exactly what you have set up on the grasslands." Haitang's hands passed naturally under Fan Xian's armpits. "But I will do my best to stop you. Other than my emperor, no one in this world can stop me, not even you." Fan Xian took off her hat and stroked her hair. Fan Xian held Haitang tightly, but his gaze gradually calmed. Holding her in his arms, he looked at the sky with narrowed eyes. An eagle was flying in the dusk. The ducks in the lake were frightened by this eagle and hid among the water plants. Haitang had actually also noticed the eagle and knew why Fan Xian was holding her like this. She sighed in her heart and knew that she and the emperor had truly let down the young man holding her. Complicated emotions rose in her mind, so she didn't point out Fan Xian's thoughts. "Stay with me for 3 days, Fan Xian said by her ear. On the grasslands about 10 li away from the lake, hundreds of Western Hu riders were surrounding and protecting their king, the master of this grasslands. Chief Su Bida looked coldly into the distance, looking at the traces of eagles streaking through the air. Songji Xianling had left. The chief was worried that she would never come back, so he had brought the riders to follow. For some reason, the chief had this worry in his heart. It was as if someone was about to take away the most important woman in his life. This woman was not beautiful. She could not compare at all to the beauties contributed by the tribes. However, the chief saw her as more important than anyone else. This woman had brought him the loyalty of tens of thousands of riders, strategies to govern a country he had never thought of, and a new atmosphere on the grasslands. Most importantly, this woman had brought the chief peace, a rare peace. Each time he was with this Karana princess, Chief Su Bida felt it was the happiest moment of his life. Even if they were just sitting face to face and looking at each other, he was still incomparably happy. He knew she was the Northern Qi Saint girl, the last disciple of the great Grandmaster Ku He, and a traveler of the mysterious longevity heaven. He also knew that Songji Xianling was a Hu person and of the same race as him. Because of her guilt, Haitang stayed with Fan Xian for 3 days and didn't ask anything else. She had no idea of Fan Xian's true goal. The light from the fire shone on their faces. Their faces were bright red, just like 2 playful children in the winter. Haitang handed 2 items to Fan Xian and said, "These are for your child." Fan Xian accepted them and found that it was a string of ruby beads and a small knife that the Hu children liked to play with. It was very cute. "The beads are for Xiaohuer and the knife is for Liangzi?" He raised his brows. "Xiaohuer will probably like it. Liangzi is still young. I'm afraid he won't like it. However, thank you for your thoughtfulness. Teacher once said that it would be difficult for Lady Fan's body to have children. Now that Fan Liang has been born, it can be said that one of her wishes has been fulfilled." Haitang smiled faintly. "Presumably, you've put in a lot of effort." 3 months ago, Lin Wanner, who had been pregnant for 10 months, finally gave birth to a son. Before the palace randomly bestowed names, Fan Xian had hurriedly given the name Fan Liang and added it to the family tree. This matter angered the Qing emperor greatly. Fortunately, Fan Xian had left the emperor the right to choose a name. Only then did he manage to bluff this matter over. Hearing Haitang's words, Fan Xian smiled bitterly. During these 2 years, other than helping the emperor deal with national affairs, most of his energy had been focused on treating Wanner's illness. In order to have children, Wanner had paid a great price. In order to develop the medicine, he had also suffered greatly. Fortunately, the path that teacher Fei Jie had set in advance was right. Only then did he successfully get Wanner pregnant. Why was he named Fan Liang? Haitang asked curiously. She knew that after tonight, it would probably be difficult for her to see this young man again. Thus, she asked endlessly, She wanted to know how he had lived these 2 years and what the people by his side were like. An idle wife is a good mother, Fan Xian smiled slightly. Isn't it interesting? The people in the tribe gradually fell asleep. Only Fan Xian and Haitang remained by the fire. Both of them seemed to have sensed something. Neither of them felt sleepy. They quietly waited for the arrival of dawn. It's almost dawn. Haitang leaned against Fan Xian's shoulder and spoke faintly. This woman had reached the time of parting and finally revealed the emotions a girl should have. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then suddenly said, "After daybreak, once you leave, that passionate chief will tear me to pieces." After 3 days, given their cultivation, they knew that not far behind them, the master of the grasslands was forcefully suppressing his anger and waiting to give Fan Xian the fatal blow. Haitang closed her eyes and said lazily, "Don't worry about these things. I'll take care of it. I'm a man."